start out small with really uncontroversial statements like, hey, vegetables are good for you. And you get this like buy-in of, oh, they seem to be just kind of sensible. And then once people actually think you're like a little bit sensible or credible, then you just bait and switch, right? And then you're just like, just eat meat, like, or whatever it is. And yeah, I call that move the hymen. So like just lure people in and then completely go off the reservation once they actually think you're kind of credible. And then you need to gaslight everyone. This is like quack at number 4, right? This is your get out. So anytime then people challenge you and they say, hang on, this is misinformation, you are like giving out you just say, well, where's the harm?
Welcome to the Proof Podcast, a space for science-based conversation exploring the health and longevity benefits that come with mastering nutrition, physical exercise, mindfulness, recovery, sleep, and alignment. Facts, nuance, and trustworthy recommendations, minus the hyperbole. Howdy friends, great to be here with you. I'm your show host, Simon Hill. I'm a qualified physiotherapist and nutritionist with an undergraduate science degree and a master's in the science of human nutrition. Today we welcome back Dr. Alan Flanagan, alongside show regular Drew Harrisberg, for one of the funnest conversations on the show to date. I think so anyway. This time in person during Alan's visit to Australia. In this exchange, we cover a wide range of topics from plant versus animal protein, the carnivore diet, whether eating more calories earlier in the day is better for weight loss, Alan's personal diet, the ethics of eating animals, what Alan thinks of various claims made by certain folks online. Yes, we play the actual clips and get his response, how to spot BS claims about nutrition on social media, and much more. And yes, it's almost 4 hours long. I thought about chopping it up, but it was too good not to share in its original, unedited form. This is Dr. Alan Flanagan, Drew Harrisberg, and myself coming at you from Bondi Beach, Australia. Please enjoy. You're in the den. Welcome to the vegan den.
Dangerous times.
You know what I really want to start with? Thanks for the present, Alan.
You're welcome.
Hopefully that's not in any frame here.
It might be. I mean, I brought the blueberries.
You did, and I'm thankful for my brain health.
Yeah. I did think about bringing you some carnivore crisps.
Do they exist? I feel like anything on the healthism spectrum exists in Bondi.
I don't know if they exist in Bondi, but I have seen people posting about carnivore crisps.
What are they made of? Liver and testicles?
No idea.
Probably.
Sounds terrible. Sounds like a nightmare.
Mate, people swear by it. Stick to blueberries.
Well, if you eat testicles, it goes to your testicles.
That's what I wanted to ask you. Yeah. I've heard the claim among the carnivore. I was more interested in if you eat bicep.
Well, that's it. Yeah. If you can you bring up a weak point by maybe just killing someone with a particularly big, quad, or like I've no calves, so like kind of kill someone with big calves.
You can't eat mine because I don't have any, and neither does he. So.
I would be challenging you to go after that person with calves.
Yeah, it's going to be some.
We'd be fighting over calf.
Yeah, true.
Bodybuilder.
All of us.
They're going to need some Eastern European genetics. Then we've got some calves.
Yeah.
Wow.
Mate, you might not have calves, but I've seen your squat in person. It is impressive.
Thank you. I mean, I was outperformed by a 16-year-old.
Yeah, but he's an outlier.
He got a double.
He's an outlier.
I got a single.
You hit 170 kilos for a single at an RPE
6 RPE, yeah, popped off the shoulders.
You could have hit 4 extra reps if you really wanted it. It looked like butter. It's just very impressive, mate.
Hold on, 16-year-old was squatting the same?
Yeah.
That's impressive.
It was really impressive. Little kid in his like school top in the gym yesterday. And I saw him smoke 140 and I looked at his age and I went over and I just like gave him a little fist pump and got chatting to him. And yeah, he went up to 170 for a double. Now it was like the second rep was a bit of a grind, but like he probably could have done one more. But still, I couldn't. 16 years old.
No, mate, he's a proper outlier. And what I love is he's so unassuming. You would look at that kid walking down the street, you'd think he wouldn't even be able to squat his body weight.
I was like, you should do a comp. He was
incredible.
Like, no.
Oh, he doesn't compete? I thought he did.
No, I thought he did.
Wow.
He's just doing it for fun.
He's just doing it for fun. I was trying to encourage him because I was like, do you play rugby? He was just like, no, just do this.
Yeah.
It's like, right, then you should definitely do a competition.
Yes, do something with that.
Do something with that. Yeah.
Did you get into powerlifting through rugby? As part of the
after rugby.
After?
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, so I was one of those people who loved strength training from an early age. Like I got a weight set for the garage when I was about 14.
Me too.
Yeah, and I loved it. And I loved that side of rugby, I think, more than playing itself at times, you know? And yeah, the season would end. I never did any like rugby specific training in my like 20s. I always just like did bodybuilding type training. And then, yeah, you finish and you kind of want something competitive still. You just enjoy having something to train for, look forward to. And I did a powerlifting camp just on my own, as in just my own, downloaded a program from the internet. And then really just enjoyed it.
Yes.
And I like the culture around the sport. It's really encouraging. It's encouraging of all different body sizes, strength levels. You know, one of the last camps I did, there was this kid there, first camp. I think he'd only started training up to that camp. And his third attempt bench press was like 90 kilos. Most people in the weight class were warming up with. And he was getting like the same cheer as a dude who hit like 162, you know?
Yeah, that's so true. Whilst on a bodybuilding stage, that doesn't happen. Like the best guys get the cheer and the guys on the peripheral, you don't even see them.
Yeah.
It's like those top three sort of front and center.
And it's exploded, like particularly with women. I think powerlifting's it's a sport where it's more the focus on what you can do, not the aesthetics.
I would argue CrossFit had something to do with that.
With
kind the of aesthetic of women
people.
Owning their body shape and size and not being afraid of getting big. And because there's a stigma with women in CrossFit that they are extremely muscular. And it became like kind of sexy for a lot of people to see women just owning their body shape.
And performing as well.
And performance. Yeah, exactly. Like the body's a byproduct of their sport.
Yeah.
You know?
I think, I'll always love strength training.
Yeah.
And actually, Eric Helms over the weekend was really cool, just talking about how, you know, for him, he was basically saying how he's just an all-round like iron culture geek. Like he loves the history of the sport, he loves everything to do with the sport, all the different facets of the sport, whether it's kind of more the aesthetic bodybuilding side or the strength powerlifting side.
It is impressive that someone like him is able to compete pretty high level in both.
Both, yeah.
Like to get that lean but be strong is not easy to do.
Yeah. Yeah, his talk was actually really, really fascinating on like kind of reverse dieting versus say recovery dieting and like the trade-offs between, like at one point he came out with this really dark line, which I appreciate because it's my humor, but you could see a couple of people being looking and he was like, you know, said something about how, you know, we're all just, you know, coming back to the broken child inside that we all are, like as bodybuilders.
He does have a dry sense of humor. It's
so
brilliant.
Good, but you could see it on some people's faces. It was like too much of a home.
Too much. So true.
What does your training program look like these days?
So right now, I told you I kind of like my lower back just in January.
Was that in like doing a squat or?
It was rolling over in bed.
Right.
Like literally. You couldn't make it up. I'm a baby sleeper, so I was basically going from like one side to the other, and I was like, "Oh, what the fuck!" And then I got up that morning, and it like wasn't that bad. And I did train that week, and again, it still was kind of like. And then 2 days after my last train, I woke up and I couldn't move.
Did you get diagnostics done? And do you know what it was? Or?
Not really. So Austin,
like a true bro,
Baraki, who's my powerlifting coach, the barbell medicine guys, and Austin's my coach, and their whole capacity to manage injury is like nothing like I've ever experienced. And I came to them injured, and we got back from that, and then this happened, and you know I'm already back to like yesterday, decent working weights. And it was just a process of, right, what can we do kind of now? For the first couple of weeks, I was literally lying on the floor with my laptop on it was bad. And then, you know, it's like, well, what do we have control over? Frequency, load, intensity, these kind of factors. And so it was getting back to movements, but it's been really slow. Like I didn't deadlift off the floor until about 5 weeks ago. Squatting was very light at the start and just doing all this tempo manipulation to get back doing it. And then slowly over time, it's like, yep, okay. And then for the first 3 weeks, you've got that mental thing where your head's in the place of injury and you're like, oh, what do I feel? And you're almost anticipating.
Right.
And so go through that at lighter loads and then you stop second guessing the movement. And then it starts to become more automatic.
Get some confidence.
And then we're starting to add load. So my training now is like I have my main squat and bench day with some assistance. I have my main deadlift day with a bench, another bench, usually like a pause or long pause. And then the other days are just, another safety bar squats, tempo squats. So
What
it's all
sort of
SBD.
volume? What sort of volume are you doing?
It's starting to add now.
Okay.
So bench yesterday, I did a single at an 8 RPE, and then I did 5 sets of 4 at 72%, 12% lower, whatever that weight was. And then
What was your top set for bench?
135.
At an 8.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it was like 4 sets back at like 115.
Solid.
So it was great. So the volume will add over time. Squat volume is now more over the week, and then deadlift, I'm still only really doing like one.
Is
But
that
deadlift
just because you're
feels
thinking
great.
about the back a bit? Or?
Yeah, but and developing the confidence again.
Right.
in it.
Do you have pain, or is
No.
the pain gone?
Now it's gone.
Okay.
And I'm not
That's
second
good.
guessing anything.
Did you guys see that viral video? I'm going to say you definitely did, of the guy benching on incline with Larry Wheels and he tore his pec off the bone. Did you guys see
I
that?
think
Jesus Christ.
I think I saw it. Yeah.
Did you see
Oh
it?
no.
You didn't see it?
I think I did.
Oh, it went all over the internet.
Yeah.
Basically, this,
No, I saw it.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
this guy's benching, incline, multiple plates each side, a lot of load. I think he was going for a max effort.
It was Larry Wheels.
Larry was spotting him,
Okay.
which is that's the guy you want spotting you when you're doing a max effort, because he literally
Yeah.
kind of saved him. But this guy went down into the full stretch position, and as he tried to come back up, you watch it and just rips off the bone completely, and the pec like coils up.
Oh.
But after watching that, every time I benched, I was thinking, please don't.
Right.
Yeah.
Just the psychological. It didn't even happen to me.
I know a few people that's happened to. I saw another video of a guy and he did both biceps.
Yes, I saw that, mate.
One just shrivels up and then he's still holding it.
Let's put some context. Preacher curl barbell, 60 kilos. That's how he did it on the negative.
Oh wow.
On a preacher.
Right.
That's the
Oh,
one
wow.
position you don't want to load the stretch
Yeah.
with that much load. So he did like empty
Although
bar,
I see people doing that quite regularly.
but he did it so strict to like this dead straight
Right.
arm, right?
Yeah.
And then they just both went and you just see he's in shock. He just looks down and he can't believe what's happened. Yeah, it's a horrible feeling.
The pain thing is interesting because I always associated pain and interpreted pain to mean there is an injury. I'm getting pain because there is damage or whatever. And one of the things Austin was really good with kind of reframing for me was, yeah, you're experiencing something and you might interpret it as pain, but it doesn't necessarily mean that there's any, and they've done all this fascinating research in this area, and like
I've
where
looked
they've
into
done
this.
sham surgeries on the
Right.
knee, right?
Yeah.
Versus like an actual intervention and
Correct.
follow up 2 years later, and people that got the sham are just like, yeah, man, he feels great.
Amazing.
And so there appears to be, for whatever reason, some people who will still detect the sensation
Yes.
that they're interpreting as pain, but there's
No
no
trauma,
objective
yeah.
sign of any injury or tissue damage. And when I first came to them, to barbell medicine, I was like, my bad elbow and kind of bicep tendonitis, and my hips were pretty fucked. And that reframing was unbelievable for me to actually be able to kind of coach myself, even in the middle of a lift. And if I was feeling a little bit of pain on the descent in a squat, I was able to kind of like just check myself and be like, you're actually not injured.
Right.
You're okay.
Right.
And then over time, you just stop feeling anything.
It's very true. It's like pain is an output from the brain in a sense.
Yeah.
I had a lecture from a guy called Lorimer Mosley. I think I might have sent you a couple of YouTube clips. World leader. He's an Australian guy. Really good sense of humor, funny guy. I met him at a conference for Sports Science Australia, and he gave a talk about pain being this output from the brain, and he spoke about some of the research he was doing. So, for example, kind of like the sham surgery stuff. So they'd get participants to have their hands on a table, and they'd get like a metal rod, and they would touch the hand, and they would say, do you feel this hot or cold? And as they did that, they would shine either a red light or a blue light. And if the light was red, people flinched like it was hot. If the light was blue, they would say it's cold, but the rod was room temperature. So it's just they program their brain
Yeah.
to give that output.
Yes.
So it's really interesting.
That's fascinating. So yeah.
But there was even one with like a fake hand, right? It wasn't their hand.
It's not a hand.
So they're watching a screen, a
Yeah, I
video
remember
of
this.
the subject.
This is great. We'll put this in the show notes.
Oh my God.
It's not their hand.
So they're what they're seeing on the video is they think it's their hand.
Yes. And then the researcher would touch the fake hand and they would feel the sensation.
Oh my God.
Yeah.
Power of the mind.
Amazing power of the mind. Yeah.
How are you enjoying the the winter.
Oh,
the Australian winter.
It's tough, lads. You have a tough life, sitting in 23-degree heat yesterday.
It's been a warm week.
You brought the Irish weather today, though, I think.
I did a little bit, yeah. It did rain once in Brisbane as well, and I feel like Queensland could probably do with a little bit of that every so often.
Yeah,
you know?
Although it's been flooded for much of the year.
Oh, has it?
Yeah, we had some terrible...
Oh, I remember
it's
the
a bit
floods,
sensitive,
but
mate.
well,
I thought that was a joke, but it wasn't.
No.
It's a bit of a sensitive topic.
Is it?
You might trigger a few people.
Oh, yeah. Well, it's not
cancel him over that.
I mean, I think it's flooded. There's been two 1 in 100 year floods.
So wait, so you're going from literally a country on fire,
right,
to a country
underwater.
flooded.
Yeah, it's been a rough.
Yeah. It's like it's the front line of this region of the world. I mean, with what's just happened in Pakistan, right? It's like this kind of region of the world seems to be where climate change is going to start showing demonstrable consequences, like in as we live, you know. And I worry about what happens when, maybe not so much for a kind of developed country like Australia, but I certainly worry what the fallout is when this starts hitting the subcontinent and you have this mass displacement of people.
Yeah,
that's the interesting thing to think about. That, I mean, I guess no one's debating that there's climate change. Some people debate whether it's human inflicted or not, but I think most people agree that humans are affecting the climate, and most of that would be from wealthier folks, but probably the less wealthy are going to be most affected by it, at least first.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah,
there's a psychologist at Cambridge. He's an American guy. I really like. I read his kind of like newsletter and Substack, but he coined a term which wasn't specific to this, but the concept you're describing it applies to. He coined it in relation to more kind of social issues, but the term is like luxury beliefs. So he called them luxury beliefs purposely because he describes them as beliefs people like wear, like a luxury handbag, or so it's a belief that someone holds about a particular issue, which kind of signifies that they have a certain stand on it for their peers, and it confers social status amongst that particular group, which tend to be university educated, well off. But the implications of if that belief was followed through with would disproportionately impact people from less advantaged backgrounds. And so an example that would have cropped up in the last few years was, you know, defund the police in America. And if you actually look at the voices calling for that, again, they were largely like posh university academics in Princeton. So the consequences of that policy are not going to affect that wealthy, you know, 1%. Well, academics aren't in the 1%, but, you know, the relative 1%. And actually, if you paid attention to what community leaders were saying, they were never saying defund the police. They were saying give us better policing and improve, you know, methodology and all of this kind of stuff. And so, but I think about that concept of issues that play out amongst essentially the wealthy that end up having disproportionate consequence for the less advantaged. And that is exactly what's going to play out. I mean, Australia is probably right now the one first world developed wealthy nation that you could think of that will be, you know, quite impacted by climate change, and maybe Singapore. But ultimately, the scale of disaster will be disproportionately, you know, low middle income countries. And then, you know, the political fallout of that, if we have mass migration, you know, I think it will fuel a continued rise, particularly in Europe, if we have ongoing like migration crises of right-wing populism. And so anyway, I won't depress you with my economic forecasts.
I was going to say, you're someone who, just from what I've seen on social media, you seem very well across politics, like global politics. Is that something that you've always just been interested in?
And with a pretty strong opinion, particularly around midnight.
Waking up
on Friday night,
late at night,
just a few beers involved.
Yeah, that's it. You know,
Are there beers involved? Be honest.
There's usually wine.
Yeah,
it's usually wine.
There's a little shot of a pint.
There's a shot of a pint or a glass of red.
I love it, mate. You wear your heart on your sleeve.
I love it when there's a rant and then it's followed by a shot of a pint.
And then it's good night.
Bye.
Good night or bye,
As I pass out at 3 a.m. with more nihilistic thoughts. Well, I mean, it's kind of it was always my kind of interest. And like, you know, my undergrad degree is history and English. Right. I started out doing politics. And then I didn't quite enjoy studying it as much as history. And that was my initial kind of 3, and then classical studies as well. But you're only allowed to major in 2. So giving up classics was tough.
What's classical studies?
Ancient Greece and Rome.
Right.
Oh, wow.
So I opted for kind of history rather than classical studies, and then, you know, into law then afterwards. And law is a profession, particularly like the bar, like the barrister kind of limb of the legal profession, where, you know, it's a profession where people are fairly kind of politically conscious, politically active. A lot of people go into politics. So it's kind of an inevitable aspect of being in that. And part of my initial interest in nutrition, I was interested in the science of it, and that developed over the course of my MSc. But looking at it all, I couldn't ever help but divorce what we have as far as population diets and everything else from the political and the social and otherwise. And so it's something that I try and keep to the forefront of when I'm posting. Because I think particularly with social media, we can really, really lose sight of, we're arguing over fucking macronutrients and stuff. And it's just like...
For someone as like academic and educated as you, how, on a scale of 1 to 10, how fucking frustrated do you get seeing a 16-year-old TikToker giving medical advice who's never read a book?
Or Liver King.
Like never Liver King.
Well, I hate it.
Yeah.
I hate it. Like I talked to Danny about this, you know, since we've been like, it's the most, if I didn't have to, I probably wouldn't be on social media. And by have to, I mean, you know, it is the primary way through which any of the stuff, the research review at the site or the podcast that we do with Sigma, it is the primary vehicle through which that is put out to the world.
Right. It serves a greater purpose.
But I mean, avoiding it, it's there. It's not going away.
Yeah. And the other thing is, I think for as frustrating as all of that is, like you say, it's not going away. But also, I think that there's a way of crafting it. Like I made a kind of conscious decision a couple of years ago to not try to dumb down or change the kind of level at which I pitch the content on social media.
Yeah.
And if there's people that are lost in that, it's a risk I'm willing to take. It's allowed me bizarrely to cultivate a pretty cool kind of core audience of followers who are smart, engaged, respectful.
That's not much of social media is like that, which is really
I know.
Yeah.
But that, I mean, that is the evidence of that is in, I mean, your account's not small by any means, but compare it to say Liver King.
Oh,
right.
And I've sat where I'm at for 3 years. Like it's never grown.
It's a grind when you take that path.
Yeah. And you see people. I remember coming kind of first into consciousness of Liver King's existence when he had probably around 60 or 70 thousand.
Yeah, same.
That was when he first picked up on my radar.
How
about a year ago.
A year ago.
Maybe a year or so ago. And suddenly he's at what, 1.4 million?
Yeah.
Which is an awful indictment on humanity.
It is.
You're like, the scale of stupidity that has to exist.
And what comes along with that is, which people don't realize, is hundreds of millions of dollars. Like people don't realize how wealthy this human being is becoming off the back of it.
He's got, like, he's a supplement company with Saladino.
Right.
The two of them have, they're playing a crafty marketing game.
Oh, yeah.
The one thing that I still haven't resolved with the way I did a video, which is on my feed a couple of weeks ago. I'm not sure if you saw it, but basically it was a bit of a 10-minute rant about platforming idiots.
Yeah, I saw it. Right.
And I said that it's really important that us in the evidence-based side try and actually platform. And it's one of the things, we recorded a podcast with Eric Helms for Iron, but the podcast was about Sigma and, Danny's 8 years now, nearly a decade of podcasting and like what makes Sigma distinct. It platforms academics, platforms nutrition researchers and scientists who people would never know, largely your average Joe that's even interested in nutrition, unless they were interested in that specific field and they'd seen their name on papers. So I think the more that we can do to kind of elevate the evidence-based community and then just hope that there's enough people that will follow on with that. But I think the idea of trying to rescue people who follow a Liver King is a lost cause.
Right.
And I've had this conversation with people who have said to me, oh, you know, do you think it's productive to call them idiots? And I'm kind of like, I don't really care whether it's productive or not, because in a world where we have this information, I'm sure that there are people that are getting misinformed.
Yes.
But if they're not willing to question why they ended up where they're at now, there's no hope of rescuing themselves. So we can't rescue them.
Simon and I talk about this all the time, about a respectful way or even a disrespectful way of calling people's bullshit out, and the importance of it. Because I think there is merit. Like, you need to, at some point, if you've got someone who's confused and they're going, okay, so Alan's saying this and here's the evidence, but then this guy's saying the complete opposite without any evidence, is it worth even giving the airtime to the bullshit? Because like you guys have your Quack Asylum, right, on Sigma, which is so entertaining. I love it.
Yeah.
But even, is that platforming the idiot in a sense? Do you know what I mean?
We had a good think about, and the difference is what we're doing with those episodes, as you'll know, because like you'll have listened to them, is we're trying to, there's 3 levels at which you might engage with an argument, right? So you've heard an argument from a Paul Saladino, right? And you've heard these claims. There are ways that someone could, with kind of more critical thinking skills, without scientific literacy, start to question those claims. Some filters. So what we're trying to do with which is the reason we play the clips, we literally like clip the person, the quack in question talking, and we play it because afterwards you can pause and try and highlight for people either a certain style they're using to frame the claim, or fallacies. So you don't even need to understand the nuances of lipoprotein metabolism to pick up on a fallacy in an argument. And so what we're really hoping with those episodes is that for people to impress, that you don't need to be an expert to ask questions. And if you can recognize some common fallacies, they tend to repeat themselves in nutrition and health. It's just the specific context in which they're being applied changes. So we tend to see the appeal to authority or the nature fallacy. We tend to see the kind of fallacy of expert, oh, we can't trust them because it's the government or it's that. You know, people should be able to pick up on this stuff without being, you know, like an expert in atherosclerosis.
So in some ways you can see the misinformation as a bit of a gift, because it could be the kind of fuel to help people become better at critical thinkers, right? Yeah. But it does kind of suck the way the algorithms are set up. So, for example, I mentioned a guy I know who posts a lot of science on TikTok, and he's done a great job doing it. But he put up a video the other day expressing his concern with TikTok and the algorithm, basically saying that unless he's prepared to share misinformation, he no longer gets dispersed and he no longer gets views. And he's had this chat with a number of his colleagues in his field of neuroscience, and they all share the same thoughts, that if they just put up the nuance and the kind of more scientific evidence-based information, a little bit less, there's no hype or hyperbole, it doesn't get the same traction. So you are incentivized to come in with a more extreme position.
I've seen that with my stories and engagement. And I've noticed this so consistently. And the first time I noticed it was actually the 2020 US election, because I was posting a lot about, to hell with nutrition, I was posting a lot about the election at the time and the potential for Trump to try and challenge through the courts the validity of the election. And I know what my running average, let's say, is day-to-day average of story views is, give or take. And I checked, and this was about twice as high. And I was like, what? And sure, there's probably like, oh, people hold down the screen and then that puts it up the people's feed more and this kind of stuff. But like, look, the reality is it's clearly being amplified because of the content. And I've noticed it consistently enough since then that if I post a story on something nutrition related, particularly where it contains a degree of kind of complex, or if it's just the dry science, the engagement is often half of the average.
Right.
And it's really frustrating then, because you're looking at this going, what's the point in trying to use a platform for the kind of communication of science and nuance and trying to help people to understand that. If you're not even getting your baseline when you do that.
It's almost like the most important information is getting somewhat silenced, and the least important stuff, the bullshit,
is getting highlighted.
Getting
and
amplified.
then to take that bullshit on, Brandolini's law, so the amount of energy that's required to refute that is so much greater than the energy that was required to produce it.
Yeah.
So you spend double, triple, quadruple the time just to try and set the record straight.
Yeah.
So as a lawyer though, as a lawyer, so you've seen the frustrations as someone creating content in the nutrition space. So there's misinformation across lots of fields, but let's just think about nutrition for a moment here. Should platforms police this?
Oh, this is such a complicated question. I think there's at the macro level, we can kind of frame this in two ways. One is, should platforms police it? And if so, should the platforms be left to police it themselves? The problem with that is we end up with a degree of selective censorship.
Right.
And we have seen that already with Twitter. It's censored academics who have questioned, for example, or indeed have argued through their own research that there is an element of social contagion in the number of adolescent girls declaring that they're trans. And there is a really important evidence-based argument to be had there. And certain voices in that research community are basically being silenced because of the view that they're taking on the evidence. That should not be happening. That's the platform deciding to come to a very particular ideological view that it shouldn't be. So it's clearly not a neutral arbiter in that scenario. So then the question is, should governments regulate it a bit more? And that brings its own issues into the mix. And then the question then is, well, if neither of those are necessarily satisfactory, do we leave the status quo continue? And that's clearly unacceptable. So the most cogent arguments that I've seen from kind of political scientists and philosophers, Francis Fukuyama and a number of others had a really great article a couple of months ago in Foreign Affairs in the Journal, which I subscribe to. And basically the most sensible scenario here would appear to be to use existing antitrust regulations, which we have, to break up the platforms. We do this all the time with monopoly power. We've done it since the early 1900s, when Standard Oil was broken up because it had a monopoly over the oil industry in America. Like, monopoly power we know is corrosive. Even before big tech existed, monopoly power was recognized as a threat to democracy.
So how would that look? Let's say someone's listening right now and thinking, okay, break these things up. What does that look like for TikTok, for Instagram when I open up my phone? Yeah,
so what it looks like is you basically break so what tends to happen is anytime any sort of new platform has emerged over the last while, it's just been swallowed up. Right. So Instagram started separately, and then Facebook are like, swallow.
Okay, gotcha.
WhatsApp starts, Facebook comes, swallow.
So they're monopolizing.
So you're literally breaking up the ability of those companies to do that. So now suddenly, sure, in that initial aftermath of a breakup, you'll still have a company itself that's bigger than others, but you're actually facilitating the emergence of new platforms, and you're protecting their ability to compete and not just be swallowed up by the existing giants that exist.
Because at the end of the day, as long as there are human beings involved, none of us are without our bias.
Oh, of course. So you're never, what we're trying to do is kind of restore the marketplace of ideas.
Right.
There'll always be a platform. Look, we have this, if you look at, for example, the kind of far-right movement in America, we're here talking about, say, Facebook and TikTok. They have all these other platforms, 4chan, 8chan, which is now 8kun. Like, there'll always be people in the internet age, whatever their political, social, economic ideology, will be able to create a platform for like-minded people to exist on.
Yeah.
And that's always going to exist in society, and it's always existed. So the thing is not to stamp out ideological differences. It's just to create more of a place where you don't have a dominant platform as an overwhelming conveyor of misinformation.
Got you. So if one of them becomes poisoned, they're not all kind of poisoned.
Yeah, exactly. And you'd be able to recognize this is a poisonous platform of misinformation, but this one isn't. So and you could potentially incentivize then the quality of information on platforms, you know. And again, we do this all the time in the legal sphere. You know, we have laws against, you know, hate speech. We have laws there, although in the modern kind of context, we've tended to lose the perspective as societies on questions like freedom of speech.
Yeah.
There are always limits on freedom of speech, freedom of expression, and we have those limits in place, and we try to minimize those limits so we can have open dialogue. But breaking up big tech would essentially return genuinely a more the kind of legitimate understanding of freedom of expression.
Right.
Because right now the platforms themselves are like, oh, we want to promote freedom. They're not promoting freedom of expression at all.
No.
So
did you guys hear Mark Zuckerberg on Rogan a couple days ago?
No, I find him terrifying.
Is that a new?
You'll see him the most human he's ever looked. Yeah, it was only.
Episode?
Oh, really?
I'm serious. Like, I listened to this
He's
episode.
human?
He's human. He's at least 10% human.
Okay, so did he talk about misinformation?
He spoke about this. So Joe asked him about censoring, I guess, news feed stories or you know, for example, the Hunter Biden laptop controversy.
Yes.
Right. Joe asked him, did you guys censor that? And if so, how and why did that happen? And he explained sort of the procedure that happens at Facebook, which was that the FBI, so government already involved, approached Facebook, Mark Zuckerberg, and said, this Hunter Biden thing, we have a feeling that it's actually fake news run by Russia or somewhere else. You might just want to be careful not to promote this story and push this story into news feeds as it might be fake news. So then what he does is then goes third party and goes to a fact checker who will then verify or help them make a decision of what to do. And what they do is they end up not removing it completely, but I don't know if this is a word, like de-amplifying it. Just sort of like the information can get out there, but nowhere near to the virality extent that other news stories would. But the concern then is that if the FBI can come and say, hey, listen, they're running the narrative.
And who's the third party?
Right.
Because a third party in theory sounds great. If there could be a third party that could always sort of adjudicate, okay, misinformation, that can't hit the algorithm, that's trusted, fair game.
Right.
That would work if the third party was trusted.
Exactly. So this is the problem.
Tail.
This is to me an example of why the status quo exactly can't continue.
Yeah.
Because I would have sympathy to someone on, say, the right of the political spectrum who looks at that scenario and says, the FBI told you to stop this? That's a bit shady. Not shady because the FBI, but shady because it's clearly like state intervention with a narrative.
Right.
So I can understand how someone would have discomfort with that.
Yes.
And as Simon said, the third party, and who is that third party and what are they vetting? So again, I just think the only way to do that is to actually just dismantle the platforms in their current state themselves.
Or the other option, which is if I remember correctly, what you said in that video, I watched that whole video, it was about 10 minutes of it was fantastic. I think you got to a point where you were like, listen, if you're that fucking idiot who falls for everything, there's nothing I can do about it.
Yeah.
Tough luck.
Tough.
Leave everyone to fend for themselves.
Yeah.
If you're going to fall for that, that's your fault. If you're going to pick up on the truthful information, that's fantastic.
Yeah.
Every man for themselves, or woman, or whatever.
To an extent, yeah. Like, as in, let's stop. I think on the evidence-based side, we often tell ourselves that we're here to help, right? We're here to help people, and I think that's fine up to a point. I think when we start viewing it as not just we're here to help people, because we help people with the information we put out, but the idea that we need to save people is a completely different concept. And I think we've kind of got ourselves to a point with a lot of this stuff where I think we're more focused now, whether we realize it or not, on saving people rather than just helping people. And I think we put out the information, and if someone, shows up to my page, for example, and then shows up on Paul Saladino's and makes a call at that point based on their own computations and whatever that looked like, that actually they find Paul Saladino more credible than me. Good luck to them.
But I think most people in that scenario will make the right call. The problem is that not everyone that's
algorithm.
following, not everyone that's getting to his page is finding your page.
Exactly.
So it's kind of a little bit unfair in that way. Like, it would be amazing if everyone that went to his page also at the same time was like, for balance, please check this out.
Well, that could be an algorithm hack, wouldn't it?
That's clever.
Yeah, if the platforms are going to exist as they are, it's just like, here, you might want to consider this.
So what about guidelines, consensus positions, and freedom of speech? So let's take an example of ApoB or LDL cholesterol. And Paul Saladino often does videos saying that he doesn't think it's a problem at all, as long as you're sort of quote unquote metabolically healthy and don't have insulin resistance, right? I think I represented his position pretty well there. But
it's not complicated.
It's not a complicated message. It's one that he recycles over and over, but he creates a lot of doubt, right? Whereas the very well established consensus position that probably 99, I don't know percentage, but the great deal of cardiologists, pretty much everyone would accept.
I don't know anyone in academia that wouldn't accept it.
Right. So in that sort of case, right, is it fair game to just be pushing out that kind of information through social media that could be very much, to our knowledge, harming people? And do you have a problem with that? And should that be censored at all?
Ooh. So I think I generally although I despise every fiber of Paul Saladino's being because of the information that he's putting out, and the fact that people will have cardiovascular events and likely die because of his information if they follow it over time. The problem is I think COVID has given us a lot of learning points, a lot of things that we can sit back and think about. And one thing that I've been interested in is, how do we learn from COVID when it comes to kind of the communication of consensus, or as it relates to science? And how do we not use science? To me, exists in service of the public good, and the public good across both the health of the public and also the development of society. So, and that's why, for example, a lot of the kind of ivory tower practices in academia and absurd charging by, some publishing companies, like, 50 quid to get a journal article. Right. I'm just like, I will always want to publish open access.
Right.
But I think COVID gave us a lot of learnings of what can go wrong when science is communicated as very didactic. When governments abuse the role of scientists and kind of blame anything on them when it suits them, but then also say we're following the science otherwise. And when consensus is used to ram down people's throats a certain point of view. And I think we saw that with a number of issues that played out over the course of the pandemic that should really make us learn from that as far as communicating this stuff goes. I think the more that science is seen as didactic, kind of authoritarian in a sense, is probably not the right word, but paternalistic. We're the scientists. We've come to this consensus now. Shuttle up now and run along and do what we say. That's a disastrous route to take.
A little bit more education and trying to teach people about the findings and empowering them.
Yes. For someone like a Paul Saladino, we have this overwhelming consensus in this example of within cardiovascular sciences, right? That consensus hasn't been arrived at just because a bunch of scientists are nodding along with each other and it's just this big circle jerk of everyone that wants to come to this conclusion. 10, 15 years ago, even the people now who have put their names to were saying, well, maybe LDL isn't the full story. And there was all this interest in HDL, and there was the CETP inhibitor phase where we were like, oh, let's develop drugs to get HDL up. And that didn't work. And the story evolves. So,
and there's nothing wrong.
This is science doing its work, So people arrive at this consensus coming from different places. So consensus in science, I think, is really powerful when the best and brightest in a given field come together and pen a paper saying, this is what the best representation of the evidence. But the question then is, how do we communicate that to the wider public? For people like Paul Saladino, they're never going to, their whole world view. I'm becoming more interested now, not in the stuff they say, but in understanding the cognitive underpinnings of people like that. You know, and we know from conspiracy theory research that narcissism is a big driver. Yeah. They're obsessed with the idea that they're the kind of one that can see through everything and see past the experts and the real truth. Right. But their followers also fit this demographic. So I think censoring them probably isn't the right angle. Again, I think there will always be people who will just believe that and follow it. The question then becomes, for everyone else, if we assume that there's always going to be a Saladino and a certain tribe that follow a Saladino, and then we assume that there'll always be obviously a science-based side and enough people that are literate enough to kind of know that's the side to fall on. If we've got this silent majority, how do we best communicate consensus or the current best available evidence that we have to that population in a way that helps them understand which side to fall down on? And I think there's a lot of learnings from COVID on that, both in terms of like the mask thing, for example. Oh, but the experts said we didn't need masks. It's like, yeah, at the time.
That's an important thing. And same with back to HDL is the understanding that science is an evolution and it's about reducing uncertainty. And just because things may evolve and a position may change over time. I mean, that's exactly what science is meant to do, right? It's a discovery process. And in the case of HDL, it's not that scientists were wrong. It's that there was a hypothesis at the time. And with continued science, that hypothesis was further tested. And then it was actually proved, well, maybe it doesn't stand that raising HDL is protective and perhaps it's more just an association rather than a causal factor.
Exactly.
And it's good to ask the question, right? That's the most important part is if there's no bad questions really. If you think about it, there's got to be everything. We should be able to look into everything.
Unless what they call jacking off on Twitter. Have you heard this? No, it's like just asking questions to sort of plant misinformation.
That's a good point. That's a good point. But I think that COVID exposed, what happened to the general public with the antitrust towards science, it's never been this bad.
No.
COVID made it so that we cannot trust any single person in authority. Science is garbage. But then
the scientists are working for government or whatever.
The irony is these same people use science at some point to try to prove their position. Saladino does it as well.
And whether they like it or not, the reason that I'm able to be here with you now is because science put a vaccine in my arm. So whether, again, there's a Neil deGrasse Tyson kind of what's now become a truism of, E equals MC squared is true whether you want to believe it or not. And that is a reality. When we have methods that science gives us, there are things that we can know and they are the closest thing to an approximate truth that we have, whether someone believes it or not. So whether someone thinks that the vaccines were all a big conspiracy and blah, 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 that opinion doesn't matter. It does for them and their decision-making, but it doesn't change the reality of, in just to use that example, I think there's two ways that we can maybe think about this kind of idea. And this is an analogy I've used before, between a kind of scientific method and a general critical thinking method that we hope people use versus like an anti-science method. And it relates to the point you both made about like things, asking questions and things moving forward. So the true scientific method is a forward moving iterative process of we start with a question, test a hypothesis, get an answer, and you're moving forward, discarding bits that have not shown to be true, refining bits that have, and it's this cumulative process of understanding and a cumulative process of moving forward closer to an approximate truth. What the likes of Saladino or anyone that's very kind of anti-science, essentially it's the reverse process. So they're starting from a preconceived conclusion and then they're working backwards, building what I call their belief scaffolding.
Right.
So they're erecting this scaffolding of belief around them with any shred of information that they can use, even if it's something that's a half-truth, that they're able to take, add it to their belief system, and basically build this structure around them. And then what we're saying is that our job is to come and dismantle that structure for them. and every line of evidence that we have really in terms of how people make decisions and change their mind shows that that doesn't work. And often actually it reinforces and makes them build stronger scaffolding. So again, I think the question becomes, how do we take the person that may be there before they've started moving backwards?
Right.
And I don't have good answers to that yet, but I think, again, like I said, I think COVID can teach us a lot about how we communicate this stuff to the public.
So let me play devil's advocate or just position a question based on things that I would hear, I think, in response to some of this.
Yeah,
would be that, okay, it's all well and good that there's a body of evidence that evolves over time, whether it's cholesterol and heart disease or vaccines, whatever it is. But Alan, how do you kind of pass out or tease out the influence of big pharma and big food, which is affecting those studies and therefore could be affecting the consensus position that is held today? Because that seems to be what a lot of people fall back on.
Yeah, I think, again, and it's a point that we try and make a lot on the Quack Asylum episodes. Often, two things can be true at the same time, right? Always in these, and that's a difficult concept for people because we like certainty. And we don't like ambiguity, and most people will kind of want to view things through a relatively black and white paradigm. Not everyone. There is some research on like kind of political leanings and black and white thinking and stuff like this. It's interesting. But point being that, like, is big pharma, not in the meme sense, but in the sense of a giant industry, often unregulated, has that industry had nefarious practices that have adversely affected population health? Of course. Yeah. Just look at the opioid scandal in America as an example. It's horrendous what they've wrought on society. Does that necessarily mean that everything, if you take an aspirin, is it bad? Does it mean that, metformin is a product of some evil conspiracy? The reality is, both of these things can be true. Like, yes, and this is why, and again, this gets more into a but I'm always in favor of stronger but better regulation than I am for less regulation. I think if you have a country, certainly with America's mindset on regulation, which is don't regulate anything, you end up with the worst of any industry. You end up with the worst of the fossil fuel industry, the worst of the pharmaceutical industry, the worst of the agricultural industry. You look at the European Union, for example, and you don't see a lot of those problems because they have strong directives, because they have strong regulation. And yeah, you can make an argument that there can be the tendency to get overly bureaucratic, which is true too. But I'd rather figure out bureaucracy and what could be chopped away than have to work backwards from a nation of small towns where everyone's basically addicted to heroin. So the big pharma thing is true. What I say to people always when it comes to industry funding, whether it's for a drug and pharma are behind the development of it, or if it's a study that, let's say, the dairy industry have funded, what I always say is, if the methods, this is where scientific literacy becomes important. If the methodology of the study is rigorous and doesn't give rise to questions, then the funding source becomes irrelevant. It's a secondary consideration.
It's harder for me to grab a hold of. Like it's a much simpler story for me just to say that big pharma's influenced it.
Yes.
And therefore I have an explanation for it.
Of course.
It's a concrete answer.
Of course. So this is where I think there are limits to how much the science communication side can go when it comes to the public. Because if you're going to sit down with a layperson in the public and say, well, it's the methodological quality. We want to consider the method of randomization, and we want to look at whether there was control.
Alan could have an ebook for £9. This is how you read science.
We'd solve it. So again, the question becomes, that comes back to more of the communication side, doesn't it? Like putting. And this is where I think total transparency has to, but the problem with social media is the narratives are bolted out the gate way before you're in a position to. So do you remember with the blood clotting thing and the vaccines? That narrative had bolted.
That was AstraZeneca.
Yes.
Is that right? Yeah. Under
and
40s.
It takes one headline and it's gone.
It takes one headline. And again, suddenly you're now trying to explain to the population the concept of base rate.
Right. Absolutely.
Right. You know what the problem is?
Like, you're fucked.
This little fucker is the problem. Before phones, think about how hard it was to spread misinformation before this little thing. Now we've all got one in our pocket. We've weaponized this little guy.
The counter argument to that is then that without these, if those that are providing information, if there's only like one main source and that became poisoned, then that could lead to all sorts of problems.
But would you not agree that before this, scientists, engineers, doctors, medical professionals were seen as, you respected them and you listened to them?
And probably more people sort of did what they were told.
Probably was. Yeah. I think there's pros and cons. Like it's also the channels of communication, right? So if you look, if we just kind of take the pre-digital era, mostly you had newspaper communication was, and then you had your broadsheets and your kind of red tops or tabloids.
Yeah.
With broad, but you still had this broad, certainly with mainstay newspapers in any given country, you had a lot of it was reporting of facts.
Yeah.
You had a lot of fact checking, and you also had a broad commitment to kind of truth and integrity. So the same issue might have a certain slant on what those facts meant relative to whether the paper was left of center or right of center. But the facts themselves were not, they were accepted. It was the interpretation. And now we have a scenario where it's the facts themselves and their existence that's being debated.
Yeah.
So we're not, where previously we were at least working from an agreed set of facts and then having a debate over the interpretation of those facts. Now we're debating the very existence of facts in the first place.
Well, now, essentially everyone now has their own, because we create content now. That's the difference.
We create
Everyone
facts.
can create content. Yeah, we can manufacture facts.
Yeah.
We all essentially are our own newspaper. Back then, you relied on, I don't know how many there were, but like a handful of platforms.
Narrow sources.
Narrow sources.
Yes.
Now everyone can create content.
And also now you can really create your own reality, your own environment through an echo chamber. Right. Which is not exposing you to the same, like you could be in the same family, and depending on who you're engaging with and following, you're in a completely different environment to your brother or sister.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think that example of big pharma and big food is actually a really good way of highlighting how difficult this challenge is. I think the one thing that always comes to mind for me when I think about this is transparency. I think the more that science and the process of science and the production of it and the communication of it can be as transparent as possible, the more you will put people in the public at a relative. If you were, thinking to COVID, the way, that it was communicated in the UK, and there was all this, and there still is all this debate about the role of the scientific advisory group that was advising government, and it was, and they did do a lot to be transparent, but you kind of had to go digging. They'd publish the minutes of their meeting.
Sure.
That should have been just totally upfront. We're meeting, we've discussed this, because it's science.
Right.
It's not shady.
Nothing to hide, yeah.
And you're just, and imagine you're being told as members of the public, in a briefing at night, by the way, we've published this now, it's on the government website, and, for those of you who want it in print, just that level, because people are then, if they've no sense that there's anything being hidden, they run out of questions pretty quickly. The questions arise from kind of being in the dark a little bit. Transparency
is always going to be critical. With trust, right? It's a must within that foundation. But you made a point earlier about elevating people that can communicate science, right? Sigma do a great job of that, and it would be great to have more of these folks amplified within mainstream media and on social media if the algorithms would play nice. For someone listening who's thinking, Well, that sounds all well and good, but maybe they're aware of certain folks with a PhD after their title that seem to have very conflicting views to the next PhD.
Yes.
How do you spot someone who is an academic that is genuinely a good evidence-based science communicator? Like, what are the kind of characteristics that you would look out for?
Yeah, I think I've thought about this. So what do people who are good science communicators typically do, even if it's on social media, where, you know, you're maybe on Twitter confined to 140 characters a tweet, or you're on Instagram confined to whatever? I think they'll rarely discuss things in absolutes. The only thing that I would come across as very absolutist on is LDL cholesterol and heart disease. I'm at a point now where I'm comfortable enough with that evidence to be like, this will put plaque in your arteries, you know. But generally, they won't be very absolutist on any position. They'll use language like may,
or
and appears
research shows, or tends to suggest,
or suggests.
Not we know that.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They'll also be,
which could be seen as a weakness to someone who doesn't understand science. So if I'm coming at this as a layperson and I'm just listening to Drew speak, I might hear may and I might hear suggest, and I think Drew might not be fully across this area of science. I'm going to go to Dave Asprey.
Yeah. who's speaking in certainty.
He's confident, so he actually has read the research. He is very, well, his ideas in his mind they're well thought out. Yeah. He's presenting them, as a statement of fact.
Yeah. He stands by it.
I'm going to believe that person more so. And it's interesting because, that's so in science, you're saying that, this is a way to spot someone.
Well, no, I'm saying this is what I'm hoping. This is I really want to keep kind of illustrating these traits and characteristics in the science communication sphere, because I think the more that people hear this, the more that they can themselves have this as a heuristic, as well as speaking in absolutes, the communication of nuance. But a really big one for me, and I've said this a couple of times on social media, a really big one for me is the simple act of, and any lay person can do this, of asking questions. Because if someone's confused, or they've heard, they've showed up on a page and they've seen some information and they're kind of like, oh, I think I've heard something else before. Any actual science communicator worth their salt, if someone respectfully, asked, look, what evidence do you have that supports what you're saying? Because I've actually heard something else. I've actually heard that all we need to worry about is HDL and triglycerides. And legitimately is asking that question. Any science communicator worth their salt will have the patience to take their time to answer that person with appropriate references and actually walk them. So I boil it down to this. I always say, good science communication is not just about saying the evidence shows X. It's being able to show people why the evidence that you're relying on supports the conclusion that it does. And that's always what I've tried to do with my approach to it on social media. And it's why I kind of go into the detail that I do on methodology and all of this other stuff, because I want to be able to show people why, if someone shows up to me and says, oh, but actually low sodium intake is as associated with heart disease as high sodium intake, I want to be able to explain to them why, for example, repeated measurements are required to get a more accurate representation of sodium intake, and why any study using repeated measures shows a linear relationship. I'm able to then actually show them why what I'm saying in terms of our current evidence is a stronger position than anyone arguing for a J-shaped curve. Yeah. So it's not just me saying, well, no, they're just wrong and I'm right.
It's why understanding why they're wrong and presenting evidence for why you're right.
That's a great point, because often, this asking question, I think it's a really good tip for people. And the response that you get is
Exactly.
such a good
It's-
clue
it's-
because
exactly.
if someone comes back like you and say, well, actually, I've written a blog on that exact specific topic, right? For me, that's like a really good sign. But when often I'll see a lazy comment of, read my book or something like that. And I'm like, the fact that you're not giving any sort of specifics and you want someone to read.
Dismissive. If they're dismissive of a
and
question
get
like
nasty
that
or
and
make
they
it
get nasty.
personal.
Yeah.
You know what? I'll give you an example, a real life example of this. I'm not ashamed to say this. When I was a keto proponent, right? I was eating a jar of coconut oil a day.
No, you weren't.
Okay, maybe not a day, a week. Roughly a week.
Did
I
you
swear
ever
to God.
get your cholesterol measured around that time?
This is where the story's going.
Okay.
Gosh, there was a few ApoB particles floating around.
Hey, my cholesterol went up from like
Should get a coronary artery calcium score, mate.
CAC, bro.
all right, boys, all right. So my cholesterol went from, and I've put a post up. I've shown the change. I can't remember the exact number, but let's just say somewhere around 3.8
Okay.
to 6.6.
Right.
Okay, so it went outside of that upper end of that normal range.
Let's convert that.
LDL. Oh yeah, do you work in that metric? What do you work in?
I understand that
You understand that?
completely,
Okay.
but I'm just wondering.
It essentially doubled.
So what was it? It was 6 millimoles.
6.6 is where I ended up at.
262.
Okay.
Yeah, well,
Oh,
260.
sorry, I made.
Okay, 255,
250 to
260.
260 milligrams.
So my mum's a GP.
That's
death territory.
familial hypercholesterolemia, right? Homozygous, maybe.
Yeah, probably. The lesser side, like because double.
Hetero. Yeah.
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 Yeah. Homozygous get up to like 500 plus, I think.
That's
don't they?
Saladino territory.
Yeah.
No, actually, he did release his.
Yes.
I should say he released his yesterday. It's actually much lower than that.
It's back down to like 130.
Yeah, because he's stopped eating. He's eating plants now.
Yeah,
and
because
he's
he's
changed his diet.
Yeah.
Simple.
He's such
But anyway,
a
my
shark.
cholesterol came back super high, and my mum is my GP. She has all my bloods, and she flags it with me, and she says, "What have you been eating?" And I said, "Well, I'm eating a very high fat diet, and I eat basically a jar of coconut oil every week. Like I was just having it on everything. I was cooking with it. And then I was having coconut butter, and I was just smashing the coconut.
I get asked all the
products.
time by folks in the plant-based community about coconut oil because they believe it's a
So
superfood.
my mum says to me, "Oh, it's the coconut oil. You're eating a huge amount of saturated fat. You should definitely cut that down." And I said, "This is me talking to my mum as a doctor. I go, Mum, that's been debunked. That was it. That was it. I was the guy on
Did that come
social
from
media.
Dave Asprey, or where'd
I
you
don't
get
know,
that?
mate. I don't know. But my point is that I was that person who fell for the paleo blog or the keto blogosphere, and I would just hear someone say something, and I would literally just regurgitate it to the next person. That's being debunked. Look into it.
So was I. Before I
Don't you hate that
started
line?
studying nutrition, I was that person too.
Right.
Yeah.
This is the very interesting point. Both as highly educated people, right? Both fell for that. So what was it that do you think that the hook that initially made you fall for that?
So for me, I saw a lot of appeal in controversial, anti-authority ways of thinking. So if someone came up with an idea that was novel and different and it went against the grain, I was like, this is an interesting person I want to listen to. So when I would hear fat's actually really good for you, especially saturated fat, you can eat as much as you want, carbs are the problem, blah, blah, blah. I was like, that's really interesting. I'm going to read their content.
So you were
consume
curious
their content
because it was different.
Because it was different. It went against the grain of authority. And where this actually came from, a lot of it was that I'd been diagnosed with diabetes and the experts couldn't give me a reason. I wanted a reason.
Yeah.
Tell me why. And they was like, oh, we don't know. The way they threw their hands up in the air, because that was honest. They couldn't say, this is why you have type 1. But I wanted an answer.
The problem is that creates a space for the next person who's going to all of a sudden have all the answers.
So then I go on Google, what causes type 1 diabetes? How do I fix it? I land on a paleo blog, and all of a sudden they've got the answer I wanted. They have an answer, even if it's totally wrong and bullshit. There was something there.
Right.
So that gave me hope. And then I'm like, okay, so these people care about me. They're going to try help me find solutions. I'm going to listen to them. I don't trust the endocrinologist who studied at university and runs a diabetes clinic. Like, it's just so ignorant.
Yeah.
But anyway, I've come a long way. And this goes back to your point. The individual has an opportunity to find both. We know that some content's being amplified more than others, but if they really care and they are a truth seeker, I think they'll get there eventually.
I think they'll come back around.
I think they'll eventually get there.
Yeah.
I hope they will.
Right, and that's a key point. If they really, truly care. Because you can just find yourself migrating into those sections of the internet purely because it's reinforcing an established belief, and you kind of given sort of reason to kind of double down on what you already believe in. Those people may be too far gone.
Yeah. And it's going to generally take. But most people aren't going to be knocked out of that kind of way of thinking if they are too far gone until something bad happens. So, you know, unfortunately, I think that a lot of people, certainly if the example we're using of that kind of community, I don't think anything will actually change for the people that are too far gone there until people start actually having coronary events, unfortunately. And hopefully it's someone like Saladino or like the proponents of it.
Mate, I don't even think that will do it, because we know
cognitive dissonance.
Not only that, we have like concrete examples of leaders in those spaces, like Charles Poliquin died young.
Oh, of course.
It didn't change anything. No one accepts this. It happened to, it was John Meadows as well.
Yeah.
So these guys are dying young.
Well, that's they're I think the confounder there is, you know, these are people that have used a huge amount of performance enhancing drugs.
Right.
So it's difficult to tease out what role dietary factors played. I mean, anabolic steroids themselves cause dyslipidemia independent of diet. So even if dyslipidemia had a role, but I think certainly within the bodybuilding space, you do see that. I remember Stan Efferding did a big post after John Meadows died, you know, just talking about how basically everyone in that community dies at 45, you know.
I want to talk about that. I want to talk about the regulations.
So, yeah, I think that community certainly seems to be having more of a bit of an honest conversation about the trade-offs between getting enormous and jacked and strong.
Now more than ever, you're hearing
death.
that. Yes.
But until it's natural competitions, right, in those unregulated ones, or where you're allowed to take whatever.
But mate, to be honest, it's got nothing to do with Olympia stage competitions. The everyday gym goer, you wouldn't believe, walk into any commercial gym or those bodybuilding sort of gyms, you wouldn't believe how many guys are on stuff.
But it's the majority. I think there was a certain, like, the vast majority of performance-enhancing drug use is by recreational trainers and athletes. Like,
it's the guys we're in the gym with.
Yeah.
But you don't think they're inspired by the bodybuilders that are actually, you know, on social media and winning the awards and on stage and all of that?
They definitely are.
Right.
But I don't think regulating shows would change it. I think it's way too far gone.
But it would show more what's possible with the natural physique. And if that's amplified and elevated, then more 18, 16-year-olds are, that's what they're exposed to, and they see that what can be achieved without drugs.
Sure. Well, that's why you hope they're, you know, your average person that's interested in bodybuilding is kind of following more the, you know, Eric Helms, Alberto Nunes, and the 3DMG kind of guys. But like, yeah, I mean, I think the sport attracts likely a certain self-selects for a certain personality type that is prone to extremes and likely willing to do anything independent of regulations or not. And I don't think that aspect to it will change. But a more honest conversation about trade-offs is probably a good start.
Has there been any, like, what sort of, I haven't looked at this, what kind of long-term studies have been done with people taking various steroids, the common ones that would be being used?
I don't know.
And what the health outcomes are.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't know that literature really well enough, or even
it's
if there is
so much is
long-term.
anecdotal.
It's anecdotal.
Yeah, you hear about someone that's early 40s dying all the time.
Yeah. Seriously, in the last 6 to 12 months, it seems like numbers are through the roof of like mid-40s guys either having huge heart attacks and surviving or just dropping dead. And the conversation has changed now. A lot of bodybuilders have retired like well before you would have thought their career would be over, because they're like, it's just not worth it anymore. I don't want to be the next victim to this. So the conversation's happening, but like, how are you going to change the 15-year-olds, 16-year-olds in the gym who can just pass this stuff around and they don't care what's going to happen in 20 years? It's too far away. It's
similar to how you eat when you're in your 20s, right?
Yeah. It's just, we don't compute forward risk.
Right.
well. But yeah, I think, I mean, what we're kind of talking about is a microcosm in the bodybuilding sense, but the kind of mindsets that are involved, like, we can apply across a range of exposures that relate to our health. You know, we can see the same behaviors with smoking, for example, where everyone's like, oh, I'll give up when I'm 26 or whatever it is.
Yeah.
We can see the same behaviors with alcohol. We can see the same behaviors with diet. So I think there's, again, it's probably how it's playing out is probably less relevant than the kind of thought processes that go into dictating the behavior in the first place.
How do you change the primal kind of instinct of just thinking about the here and now and versus somehow thinking about long-term health?
I mean, it's the environment, right? It's going to be our interaction with the environment. And this is why, I mean, we do have examples of multiple successful, you know, alterations in the environment or the use of regulations to change the kind of behavior within an environment that have improved public health. So seatbelts is just a great example. No one stopped driving cars, but we really kind of went in on regulations for seatbelt use, and there's been a massive decline in road fatalities. Cigarette smoking, cigarettes are still ubiquitous in society. We can go and buy them now. But the various interventions, there's learnings from that as well. Like there's evidence, for example, of like saturation points where the messaging is initially really ineffective and then people tune it out. And I think there's some important learnings there for like public health nutrition. But there are examples of, again, vaccination up until it becoming really contentious. Another example of, you know, eradicating entire diseases from the population. So the ability is there. Previous examples are there. The question then becomes, how do we take some of what we've learned from these and apply it to other contexts? I think the steroid example is probably too niche. In reality, bodybuilding is a fairly niche aspect of the community. And even within it, the people, like,
it's a minority.
It's a minority. If we're thinking about the bell curve of a population, they're up in that 97th percentile. And you never frame public health stuff around those issues. I think in terms of the primary determinant of our health now, of health generally, is not those kind of outlier behaviors. It is diet and movement, lifestyle and exercise. And if we go one step back from that, then mostly what we can kind of see as the unifying theme is that the biggest driver of health or ill health in society is all of these kind of socioeconomic and environmental factors. And that's where suddenly the conversation becomes a really difficult, honest chat that we have to have as societies about what kind of societies we want to live in and whether it's acceptable that in, for example, the London borough of Chelsea and Kensington, which most people, if they've ever been to London, or even if they've ever watched Made in Chelsea, would associate as like a very wealthy, well-to-do part of the city. But like any area in London, it has haves and have-nots. And the life expectancy difference in the very same part of the city between the wealthiest and the poorest is 22 years.
Wow. And
so any society that can have two people born in the exact same place in a city and one person die 22 years before the other.
That's astonishing.
It's astonishing. Has some really deep questions to ask of the social conditions it creates in which people are expected to then live their lives.
Wow.
So what are the biggest drivers of that, if you think about it? Because like they're actually living in the same physical environment or similar, right?
No, so that's the thing. They're living in the same geographic borough of London.
Okay.
But the housing conditions are significantly different. The access then to schooling is significantly different. If you use, I've posted about this before, but I think it's really instructive. If you use free school meals as a proxy for social deprivation, right? So the free school meals, people receiving free school meals are, and if you look at educational attainment in people receiving free school meals versus those who are not. So as a proxy for people who are really socially disadvantaged versus less so, then what you see is as early as basically age 7, there are disparities in subsequent educational attainment, like leaving primary school, going to secondary school, getting through, GCSEs. Do you have that here? Do you have like exams at like 15, 16 or?
No.
We have.
You just have your leaving exams?
Year 12.
Your year 12 exams.
So,
getting to them. So at each stage of those stages of attainment, anyone receiving free school meals is already having significantly less attainment over time. So there's the housing factor, there's the education factor, there's then the access to food. We know with a lot of the research that you're in these areas that are, I mean, I don't even like the term food desert, but they have the highest concentration of fast food outlets. They have the cheapest food, which is in terms of its health profile, the worst. There's also this illusion of choice, which is really important, where you've got, say, a Chicken Shack, a McDonald's, a KFC, and a Burger King. It's like, oh, there's choice between, but nutritionally, that's not choice. Yeah. It's the same thing in a different box.
Yes.
And there's all these issues that we tend not to think about that intertwine all of these factors. So, in just as one example, in relation to the overlap between, say, housing and nutrition, if people are in poor housing accommodation, and they may not necessarily have even the kind of like tools to be able to cook. They might actually only have a microwave.
Wow.
Buying perishable food, we're always, fruits and vegetables. Right. They're perishable.
Right.
That's not economic. If you're on a really tight food budget, and there is research on this, it's not economically sound to invest in bananas that the kids might not eat, and then they might go off 2 days later.
You talk about this all the time, about, to an extent, the plant-based diet that we follow is somewhat of a luxury.
Well, just a healthy diet in general.
Right.
That's not
a healthy diet is a luxury.
It's a luxury.
Independent of whether it's, if I think of my like general in-home diet, which is kind of more on the pescatarian spectrum.
Mate, you're a vegan.
Like,
we know.
I'm quarter vegan.
Hang on, we're going to dissect this. We're going to pull back the layers, on this in a moment. You're not getting out of here.
He's pretended. He's been pretending for years that he's vegan. No, we know that.
I want to understand. I want to understand. I know that you're 1/3 vegan, I think, on your mum's side, but we'll come back to that.
Genetically vegan.
Continue.
I'm going to live forever.
Continue with your train of thought.
So this is the thing. You're right. Any sort of iteration of what we would consider a healthy diet is a diet that is generally requiring, or at least a luxury in some way, shape, or form.
The pushback on this that I always see, which is not considering all of those different layers of the onion that you just mentioned. So there's all these things that you can stack up on someone's life that either increases their probability of being healthy or decreases their probability, right? And that's enormously complex. And, often we hear about the blue zones, right? I think they'd just be an example of, it's not that these people have enormous willpower, right? They just live in an environment where it happens to be easier for them to adopt a lot of healthy habits that get stacked on top of each other, right? And not everyone has that privilege.
And just being born there is the privilege, right?
Right. And so the pushback that I was going to come to is that people say, well, you're saying that it's, it's a privilege to eat a healthy diet, but we're talking about beans and rice. These are food that people eat in nations with not a lot of money. They're cheap foods. So how is this actually, how is this a diet for privileged people when we're talking about the cheapest foods on earth? That's what I want to hear you talk to.
I have actually, so there's a couple of layers. I'm actually going to read something out. I'm pretty sure I've put it in here. So I'm
impressed that you have that, because none of this is scripted.
Right. So no, I've just pulled it up. It's one of the things, I got into this debate before with Mike Isertel, and we had a back and forth, and I originally, he did a post on a lot of this stuff, like, obesity is a choice, basically. And I took the kind of 10 main points that he had made, and I kind of addressed them as questions in a blog post. And then we actually had a really productive kind of subsequent exchange. He said, I've read the article. It's really interesting. I have some further thoughts. Sent me a Word document with a bunch of stuff. And then I published the what was our kind of like addendum, so to speak. And a big part of it was, he had said, well, look, you go to the supermarket, beans, can of beans, 50 cent rice, these are staple foods. They are, but to the best of my knowledge, no one sits down and just opens a tin of kidney beans and sits there eating it with a spoon.
Right.
They're foods that are staple, but they require...
Mate, we're going out for dinner later. Wait till you see what I pull out of my bag.
Pours chickpeas on it. Like, oh my God.
That's so good.
So, you know, so they are staple foods, but they do require food preparation. And so then food preparation, does someone have food preparation skills in the first place? Do they have the kind of amenities in their home environment to then put those food preparation skills to use? There was a UK parliamentary investigation into poverty and diet. And they did this really brilliant kind of paragraph responding to the question of, well, why don't people in poverty just make soup? And why don't they make soup? So I'll read this out, right? So it says, the person following well-meant advice to prepare vegetable soup may first have to persuade the family that the dish is enjoyable. A person following this advice may look up a recipe. They may not have access to recipe books, so they spend time looking on the internet. They be new ingredients for the recipe, such as stock, possibly flavorings, which they would have to purchase. With a more complicated recipe, some ingredients may not be available in the local shop. Having spent time discovering this, the person may have to go to a different shop further away, taking longer, possibly incurring transport costs. If the ingredients are available in the local shop, these ingredients are likely only to be available in small quantities, decreasing value for money. We were told that the cost of the ingredients of a new meal without a middle-class store cupboard. So if you're going to create a new meal and you're living in poverty, the cost of actually acquiring the ingredients to create that new meal is estimated at £15. That's not insubstantial. It's way beyond most people's food budgets. While looking for perhaps unfamiliar ingredients, the person shopping will have to ignore other tempting display options or price promotions. They're likely to be less healthy foods, foods that the family may have tried before. If shopping with children, the person may have to ignore pest or power. The kitchen equipment required for the recipe, weighing scales, knives, peelers, ovens, stoves may be unavailable or inadequate, making the process more difficult or perhaps impossible. Following a new recipe, particularly if not familiar with cooking generally, can be stressful and time-consuming. If the soup goes wrong, is unpopular with the rest of the household, or simply doesn't taste good, the household may not want to eat and may want to eat something else. Thus, 2 meals have been paid for, and the time, money, and energy spent on the original meal has been wasted. The remaining ingredients may also go to waste. Hungry children or growing teenagers may not feel full, so may want to eat something else. Separately, these difficulties are not insurmountable. Combined, they represent a real barrier to accessing a healthy diet. When there are so many easy, cheap, and reliable alternatives available, this process is a distinctly unappealing proposition. And I think that really, for me, summarizes exactly why just getting rice and beans isn't a solution.
Well, it could be a solution one day, but what that does is it acknowledges what the actual barriers are, which is critical to trying to like actually unpack all of this. Because there is an analysis that recently came out that I saw that was on climate change, and it was looking at the effect on the environment of different dietary patterns, and also they did look at the cost savings. And in that analysis, it certainly was cheaper to eat a sort of whole food vegan diet, and it was better for the environment.
Compared to what though?
Compared to a kind of another, no, not a standard Western, just another. There was vegetarian, pescatarian.
So they had different dietary patterns.
Right.
So in a certain way of formulating such a diet, it could end up being cheaper, right? But that point in and of itself doesn't mean that it's a solution now for everyone because of all of the various barriers that exist. There's so much red tape there. And if you want to go about trying to get people to eat a more sustainable diet, whether it's an Eat Lancet diet or whatever, it's not as simple as just saying, guys, here's an image of that diet. Go out tomorrow and feed your family this food.
Because you know what, it's like saying, oh, you're overweight, eat less.
Well, that was my problem with the Eat Lancet report when it came out. It wasn't nothing to do with the recommendations that they'd formulated, which do not
Your plate
delve into the, like, I'm not particularly literate in the environmental side.
We will be delving.
But when the report came out, it was the way that it was kind of framed and the way that it was kind of, and it was very hand wavy, and kind of, oh no, we've done the calculations. This is fine. You know, it was that didactic science thing we were talking about earlier. We've done all the research. Run along now and do this. And it's like, how are people going to do this?
Right.
And it came with all, and I just found it to be quite classist and elitist in its presentation. And it made me a little uncomfortable because, again, it was just like, oh, well, this is great for anyone that can do it.
Right.
And I can interpret the nutrition information I'm being given and act upon it. But how is anyone else going to do this? So again, this kind of brings us back to this reality we need to face, that really, when push comes to shove, the questions aren't really about diet anymore. And we don't have a knowledge deficit in nutrition science for what foods, broadly speaking, are good. What we have is a whole range of social, environmental, and economic factors. And by environment, in this context, I mean like built environment, local environment, this kind of thing. Factors that are coalescing to influence increased probability of health, like you said, or decreased probability of health. And right now, we've created social conditions where the overwhelming society needle is tipped towards increasing probability of ill health.
Yeah.
Right. Just to be clear as well, we're talking here about the macro solution. Like, of course, there'll be some people that are listening that they absolutely, they're in a position to make lots of changes, and that's amazing.
And not even that, Simon. I've had people reach out to me who've come from really disadvantaged backgrounds, and often they're a bit, they're interesting to interact with because they'll say, well, look, I came from a really disadvantaged background and we always managed to eat healthy, so I don't, buy this. And I'm like, look, I absolutely accept and that's great that you were able to navigate difficult circumstances, but that doesn't mean that everyone in that circumstance can do what you did. And I actually find that people that fall into that category are often the least compassionate in discussing poverty and health and diet and nutrition and stuff.
That's a good point.
This whole combo is a good reminder, though, about not judging how other people are eating. You can put the information out, but it's only the family or the individuals who can find the level of commitment and navigate the changes that they can make. And with the wrong language or the wrong way of communicating, it would be very easy to leave those people feeling shameful about not making enough change. Right. Whereas the fact that they can't make change is often through no fault of their own. It's a result of the environment.
I'm guilty of that, for sure. Like, I'm aware of it as well, though. But like, I'm so quick to judge people, not just
from
dietary,
your own shoes.
Yeah, from my own position, just because I feel like I did it. It's not that hard. Or, like the other day I put up just as a joke, like an unfriendly reminder: get a reusable cup, you lazy bastards. Like, even that is a judgment on people who aren't using a reusable cup. But like, it transcends diet and it goes towards everything. And I think that I probably have to dial back my judgments towards other people because it's virtue signaling.
It's a balance, right? Because you want to sort of lead and set an example and educate. But then how can you deliver it in a manner where you have the compassion to understand that not everyone has the same capability as you to eat the exact same diet, to drive the same car, all that sort of stuff.
Exactly.
Yeah. So I've been kind of trying to think more recently on there's an amazing book. It's a kind of more of an academic textbook, but it was actually written by a couple of UK, one's a geography professor, I think, or maybe they both are, but they've written a lot. They've written a kind of textbook on like food in society, and it's looking at it more from a kind of sociological perspective. And I revisit it every now and then because I find it really helpful to explain like why does food, diet play this role certainly in modern, I think there was probably a point in time where most people in society didn't give a second thought to what other people eat. We're so invested in it now. And there's a British sociologist called Alan Ward, and he wrote a book in 1997, it was published then, where he kind of identified 4 major themes. One was what he called arbitrary individual diversity. So this is where the individual consumer in our socioeconomic kind of societies and models is the focal point, right? And we have, and then the second, related to the second theme, which was we've had a societal shift generally away from class as the defining delineation in society to lifestyle groups. So people, and because of the internet, then that facilitates being able to identify with a certain lifestyle group that share similar lifestyle characteristics, rather than based on other, you know, kind of economic classifications of society. So an individual is now free to choose from a range of different lifestyle choices that they may not have in that same community 50 years ago. And then we have these kind of mass consumption patterns, right? This process known as like McDonaldization. And so even though we have all of this choice, it's against this kind of background paradox of this really homogenous diet, which is why if we were looking at the general population macronutrient intake, salt intake, saturated fat in Australia compared to England, compared to America, we'd largely see the same characteristics of diet. And then we have this like social differentiation where we have choice as an expression of identity. So people, it's not just that they're self-selecting to be part of a certain lifestyle group, it's that their choices within that become a part of their actual expression of who they are.
Yep.
And that becomes really complicated. So you're no longer taking someone who follows a low carb diet versus follows a plant-based diet and having a conversation. It's, I am low carb. I am. And so it's this I am rather than I do. And that creates a very difficult landscape and I think it's why we have so much emotion, moralizing, shouting. I think it's why it's such a fraught conversation right now.
It's funny, like try think about any other lifestyle factor that we own the identity of that thing.
Here's one.
Give me on.
I am Marlboro Light.
Rather than I run. Rather than I run. I am a swimmer.
I'm a cheeseburger.
I am Winnie Blue.
With exercise, the same thing happens, and athletes.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's true.
Yeah.
All right.
But that's probably why runners always just slag weightlifters and weightlifters slag runners.
But that kind of embodying the runner or the swimmer, the identity is often actually positioned as a positive thing to then help build the habits that a runner would do, right? So it kind of you can use it in a positive way, but it could also become something that is negative.
Well, we saw that the one divide now that you bring that up that I can think of was bodybuilding versus CrossFit. You're a CrossFitter? Oh, CrossFitter. Roll your eyes. Right. You throw weights overhead and drop them on your face? Okay. You know, and then the body, you know, it's just, that was one of them where it was like, that is identity. It's who you are.
How about that CrossFitting, the video I sent you the other day?
So good. Who was the guy narrating it? He does loads of like...
He was a bodybuilder doing CrossFit style movements.
Yeah. By the way,
oh my God,
for a power lifter,
you
walked from Bondi Junction to Bondi Beach.
I did. I'm impressed.
That's impressive,
you know, and
mate.
I didn't get an Uber.
It's a nice walk.
Good cardio. Your heart still works.
Yeah, exactly.
That's 10,
in the rain.
That's got to be 10,000 steps in the rain.
I'm going to put that video up. It's a great video.
Marching in the rain.
This Irishman is marching in the rain as if it's not even raining.
Can I ask you, this is changing gears a little bit.
Yeah.
I know that you're over here. I believe you're over here as a sort of bit of a protein expert. Would that be true?
Certainly. It was, it's true for a day.
Which was, I know, it's interesting because most of the content that you would put out is not really related to kind of bodybuilding or protein or whatnot. It's usually, I guess, far more important topics.
Yeah. I mean,
like metabolic health,
public health.
I was surprised to get the invite. To be honest, I was just like, why do they want me to come?
So I thought you were bro. You've now confirmed it. And then clearly looking at the size of you, do people when they meet you are most people, because you don't put up a lot of content about lifting and whatnot? Are people kind of surprised?
Yeah, so some person messaged me yesterday and was just like, I can't picture this side of you.
Yeah, mate, I'm going to be honest.
I posted a couple of like,
I was surprised.
You know, every now and then I drop it in, and like some people are just like, I just picture you in like a lab coat or something.
Same. It's to have brains and brawn is kind of hard to have. He's got a balance.
He's a lawyer. He's a PhD.
Imagine this guy coming to represent you.
Dr. Alan Flanagan.
Criminal lawyer shows up. He can squat 220 kilos.
So there's a guy that a former colleague, and he was really big into his own like bodybuilding, natural bodybuilder, and the like photographs of this guy are like he's in incredible condition. But I'd see him, so I used to train in this kind of like gym in Dublin that was pretty kind of hardcore. He used to train there. It was really close to where the law library was. We'd be the only two kind of, you know, so we'd like give each other the nod or whatever and have a chat. But then I'd see him, you know, in work, and obviously like in the law, like in, you know, you wear the gown and the tabs and stuff, and I'd see him in that, and I'd kind of just be like, wow, it's gas. Like no one has any idea like how absolutely jacked
underneath that,
shredded this dude is underneath that. So yeah.
Okay, so come over here to talk about protein.
Yes.
So let me start with how much protein does Dr. Alan Flanagan consume per day?
I don't know.
Great answer.
I don't know. I haven't tracked anything now for...
Well, mate, when you're eating packets of this every 5 minutes, you don't have to track it.
That was a bit cheeky. That was cheeky. That was a bit cheeky. Do you want to tell people what the present all the way? This is not from Dublin. It's a local.
Oh, well, I was going to bring the other was a crate of VB, but I decided I couldn't carry that walking down from Bondi.
Okay.
So I got beef jerky instead. Which actually would fall into the definition of processed, wouldn't it? So what gram amount do we have here? 50 grams, that's it. That's your colorectal cancer threshold. Don't need it.
We'll give it to...
is that same association, does that stand for dogs as well?
Oh, God, poor dogs. No, they're obligate carnivores pretty much, aren't they?
Yeah.
Omni.
Cats
well, I was thinking for processed meat, so not for regular
I don't
meat.
know. I know people who do feed dogs like raw food, raw meats, but
we'll come back to that.
We'll come back to that. So I haven't tracked in a few years, partly because I kind of had a natural evolution away from it, partly because I also obsessively tracked for a good few years. But I kind of, again, the good thing about a certain degree of nutrition literacy is I kind of have a default setting for, and I don't think about fats and carbs anymore, but I definitely have a little radar in my brain for protein.
Right.
Yes.
And I do make sure that I like get kind of, you know, I'm also kind of more of like a 3 square kind of meal a day type person rather than smaller meals. So I'll tend to probably supplement those 3 meals with like another, you know, shake or something.
It's pretty much exactly what I do.
Same.
Yeah. And I use this, you guys, I mean, I don't know if you can get it here yet, but I use this supplement. It's more of a meal replacement. It's called Whole Sup.
Is this a plug? Do you have a coupon code?
Not even,
With that t-shirt, I would expect a coupon code.
But it's great because it's a whack of like 50 grams of protein in a serving. But the company seem to use some like extraction method. So it's all plant-based, but it's not like soy-based. You know the way a lot of like plant-based proteins are kind of like soy, pea, blend whatever.
Pumpkin seed, this, that,
They're using some extraction method to then create a plant-based protein that basically has like the amino acid profile of
whey or something.
Yeah, like it's really cool.
Sign me up.
So,
I'd do it.
But it's also more of a meal replacement as well. Like it's but again, that just helps me hit that kind of total.
Sure.
But I definitely have the little protein radar in my head. So
Yes.
I would wager I'm probably around, I don't know, 150 or 60 grams a day, maybe. Anything between 140 and 160, depending on the day. And I'm probably just...
I'm surprised more brands aren't using potato protein isolate in their blends because it's much higher in leucine than a lot of the other ones. But maybe it doesn't taste, maybe it's a bit gluggy or something.
Yeah, I can imagine it's possibly the kind of like the glutinous kind of starchy.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, this is the challenge with the plant-based protein scene.
Yeah.
Even for making, like, it's really interesting that you still, in the protein bar space, it's still pretty much exclusively, you know, Grenade or any of the big, like Fulfilled, any of the big brands are typically still using whey milk or a blend of like milk and soy.
There's some decent ones here now, like Greenback, but they tend to have less total protein because as you get up, ramp it up a bit more, it becomes a bit more kind of grainy or earthy.
Yes. So it's the challenge.
Yeah, but that kind of brings up, so if you increase the protein in those bars, right, so you can maximize MPS, right? This is kind of what we were talking about the other day about that post lane put up, right? a lot of the conversation just keeps going back to muscle protein, digestibility,
and MPS.
And MPS.
And how important is MPS versus, say,
it's a proxy. It's a proxy.
And Lane would push back and say that many of these studies don't have the right tools to get really specific with regards to any differences in lean mass, and they're too short term, and maybe there are bigger differences over a long term.
There is a point there. So we recorded after the conference, Danny and myself and Eric Helms recorded a big podcast just on protein, which will come out soon. But a big part of it was discussing the fact that the idea that this is, and one of my main themes in my lecture last Saturday was, anyone arguing that any of this is settled science is treat with some skepticism. And I think we see that. I think part of the problem as well is, once the debate, I wrote it like a post for the Alinea Facebook group where I was like, the problem is once we frame it as animal versus plant, the whole debate gets lost.
Yes.
It dichotomizes it into the kind of the ideological camps. It also is asking the wrong question.
Yeah.
It's like, if we look at this area of research, even within a class, a designation of animal or plant, the idea that all proteins are somewhat equivalent.
Yeah.
You compare whole eggs to egg whites, you see a greater impact on MPS for whole eggs. You compare milk to beef, you see a greater short-term impact over 2 hours of milk, but over 4 hours, no difference. You compare, pea seems to have a greater effect than soy.
Right.
And all of this. So we're asking the wrong questions. Different foods have different effects.
Yes.
The food matrix is likely a relevant factor. And most studies don't even consider food.
Yeah.
The vast majority of this literature is using protein isolate versions. We don't have a single study that compared tofu to Greek yogurt in a postprandial period.
And even then, though, I would argue the ability to generalize from that to someone who sits down and eats a mixed meal is different again.
Exactly. And so Eric made the point that if you look at the studies that suggested these kind of like, the bolus kind of, you don't want a massive bolus, but you don't want excessive dosing. You want these like pulsed protein, 4 across the day.
430 grams.
But they had participants come in fasted, and then all they gave them was 80 grams of whey in 4 20-gram. So there was no food in the background.
Right.
These were studies where all they were having was whey over the day. So can we, as you say, extrapolate that to having whey in the... Now, there was a systematic review that looked at the impact of supplementing meals with additional protein, either at meals or between meals.
Okay.
And that suggested that actually there wasn't really much of a difference between those strategies. So I think that there's a lot of... And there's even unknowns with... a lot of the conversation gets bogged down in this idea of protein quality. And the old kind of metric was the PDCAAS, the protein digestibility corrected amino acid score. And the problem with that is it was measuring amino acids in the large bowel, in the colon. And there's bacterial metabolism. It's not a representation of small intestinal digestion. So then, and that was recognized almost from the moment the PDCAAS was used. And then you have the development.
So that could be overestimating the amount that's absorbed.
Or even misestimating because of bacterial amino acid metabolism.
And is that in animals?
It was in pigs, rats, and humans.
Okay, so you have human studies looking at that.
You have, but it's difficult to do. And then you have the digestibility indispensable amino acid score, which also does have some human data, but also so the order of priority for assessing the digestibility is obviously it's preferable to have human data, and then I think it's pigs, then I think it's rats.
Right.
But what the DIAAS changed that makes it slightly better is it was looking at terminal ileum amino acids. So it's assuming, this is the end of the small intestine just before we go into the large bowel. It's more representative of what's been absorbed in the small intestine. But even that's not perfect. And no one that was involved in the FAO, WHO working group that developed this new metric, as soon as it was published, they're like, these are the limitations, So even at the level of just amino acid metabolism, there's a lot we don't necessarily know.
Yeah.
There are those... and the metrics, the outcome metrics that we use to interpret this data don't always fully explain outcomes and findings. So, for example, the leucine threshold. that is important, it appears. And yes, if you match leucine dose between, say, a plant source protein and an animal source protein, you tend to see, but it actually doesn't explain the totality of the effects. And then there's the idea that, well, actually it's kind of total like amino acids and essential amino. You want to flood the circulation with amino acids to get adaptive responses. But that in and of itself doesn't explain it. The group in the UK that have been doing the mycoprotein research did a comparison between just the mycoprotein dose and the same mycoprotein then enriched with extra BCAAs. They actually found that just the normal mycoprotein still had a greater effect. So you can't just flood the system with essential amino acids and get a benefit. And then MPS itself and often what's measured is circulating leucine levels.
Yeah.
That doesn't even compute. So, you know, for example, in the mycoprotein study that compared to milk protein, Benjamin Wall's research group, the milk protein significantly elevated circulating leucine, but the mycoprotein had a significantly greater effect on MPS. So it's just not as simple as you take in a certain dose of essential amino acids and leucine, and bang, leucine goes up and MPS gets stimulated, and that's grand. And again, a lot of studies measure over 2-hour postprandial period. What about over 4 hours? What about over a whole day? And a lot of these questions remain relatively unanswered. So we're trying to parse evidence to come up with a big picture. And ultimately, you do have the couple of interventions. There was one that compared kind of vegan athletes to omnivorous athletes over a kind of relatively short-term period. I can't remember.
Is that the one out of Brazil?
Yeah.
I had Hamilton on the show.
Yeah. So that was interesting. So where they were hitting that kind of 1.6 gram a day intake, there was kind of basically little to no difference between groups. And I think,
and even then, leucine was lower in the vegan diet,
but it was still over that threshold of about 1.6 grams of leucine,
getting up there.
So there was I think the animal group, the omnivorous group, had about 0.5 or 0.6 of a gram more leucine, but it seemed like the leucine
on a per meal basis. Or?
I think it was overall, if I remember. But again, I'd have to go back and look at that table. But the point is, I remember thinking, okay, yeah, they had more, but the plant protein
threshold
group,
was met.
Exactly, the threshold was met.
They were having, and at both groups, I think, were having protein shake. I think.
Yes.
I think the plant or the vegan group was having slightly more through a protein shake. It was like 60 grams of protein from soy. Per day.
Yeah.
But that was interesting. You know, going back to what you were saying about the digestibility, something else that I think is important to consider when looking at, because often you see like DS scores posted, people sharing them, and again, people are like putting one up against one. It's like, guys, we eat mixed meals,
right?
And but the other thing that I found interesting, and there's a guy Mariotti, I think he's French, does a lot of research on protein. He wrote a review paper and was speaking about the fact that the majority, not all, but the majority of studies looking at DS, looking at ileal digestibility. When they're using plant proteins, most of them are fed as raw protein.
Yes.
You know, trypsin inhibitors, for example, which are binding up protein, are broken down with soaking and with cooking.
Yeah.
So if you wanted to, you could potentially be overestimating the difference in digestibility between a plant and an animal protein if you're not preparing it.
But that's where the stable isotope studies now, yes, they have been done in nutritionally vulnerable populations consuming traditionally vegetarian diets in India, but that's where those studies add another twist in the tail, because they looked at mung beans, chickpeas, and yellow peas, which were the kind of staples, and they found, relative to what the DIAAS scoring percentage would have them as, lower than expected digestibility when they use stable isotope tracers. Now, is that a reflection of other factors? Is it a reflection of the fact that they're kind of just reliant on those staple, like those individual foods? Again, it's not representative of total diets that we would consume. But I think that we need to leave like a little bit of an open tab on some of these questions, because I don't think we know. I think stable isotopes might shed more on the topic. They might not. It might be that what they shed light on is really more relevant for nutritionally inadequate populations, rather than having relevance for kind of Western
Someone needs to
populations.
write a paper that is basically summarizing current knowledge, what the limitations are, and in this area of research, what things should be considered for future
Might say it
research.
But you know what? That's a good point you made, because even this conversation to a degree is like a privileged conversation, because we're talking about like maximizing MPS so we can maximize every gram of muscle, you know.
Yeah.
But really, all these scoring systems, they're not really meant for jocks like us who go to the gym. They're meant for...
And the one thing that I would say is, as much as, you know, a lot of the focus, well, it's this 1.6 gram, you know, threshold. It's just like, as Danny pointed out, he was just like, who the hell in Gen Pop is hitting 1.6 grams of protein per kilo of body weight?
Yeah.
The one area that I do think that there is a kind of a consideration for where there could be need for higher or at least diversified protein intake is in relation to the RDA. The 0.8 gram per kilo of body weight makes no distinction between omnivores, any iteration of vegetarian diet, or vegans. So it's not taking into account any of these factors. And so and we do know from just survey data that people that consume, there's almost an inverse relationship between the amount of animal sources of protein in a diet and total daily protein intake. So there's been research in that looked at vegetarians, and like they're habitually consuming lower protein intakes.
I think is it about 1.3 grams per kilo for the average omnivore, and around 1 gram per kilo for a vegetarian.
That's where I do think that factors like the digestibility quality scores are probably relevant, because if you're just consuming 0.9, say, then the composition of that 0.9 would matter.
I think that's a really good point. This stuff becomes so much more relevant if you're not consuming an optimal amount of protein. Right.
And an optimal we're defining in terms of basically sports nutrition literature. So yeah, I think there are some open questions there. I think more research in kind of, you know, industrialized populations actually needs to be done on this.
But I think like if you care about, I think the takeaway for a lot of people here is, if you do care about being athletic and building muscle on a vegetarian or vegan diet, it's absolutely possible. What we care about is the outcomes.
But that's
outcomes more important than leucine threshold, MPS, 4 meals a day, spread it by 4 hours. What is the outcome?
Definitely.
Can vegan and vegetarian bodybuilders or athletes or performers in any sport achieve hypertrophy and strength?
Sure, of
absolutely.
Course. Yeah,
we know that, right? You do have to eat a little bit more, maybe,
possibly. But again, even most of the recent syntheses of evidence suggest that actually, you know, once you are hitting that kind of total daily protein intake range, the source is secondary.
That makes sense, yeah.
And then the other area, though, where this gets really important, and I think it's all of this and the fact that there's some uncertainty is more reason to not be dogmatic with regards to, you know, often I see the message within the plant-based community of just don't even have to worry about protein.
I see that. I don't think that's helpful.
Like if you get Stuart Phillips, I had him on the show, and he's really interested obviously in like sarcopenia and you know, trying to prevent osteoporosis, and he talks a lot about the RDA being probably on the lower side if you're trying to be optimal for healthy aging and maintaining good skeletal muscle mass as you age, which we know drops off. I think there's a conversation to be had around actually, you know what? You actually should pay attention to how much protein you're getting in your diet. Not if you're if you're an athlete, but I'm just talking about general pop. And particularly as you start to eat less animal foods, right? You should probably be paying a little bit more attention to make sure that you're you know, not setting yourself up for sarcopenia and osteoporosis.
And a lot of people go from vegetarianism to veganism. You're dropping eggs and dairy. All of a sudden, to replace those protein sources with legumes, whole grains, nuts. Again, you got to plan even more.
I think people were scared to have this conversation, right? Because if you acknowledge that, then you're acknowledging a weakness.
That seems to me to be the defining feature now of the conversation around the kind of plant-animal dichotomy. And I think it's really unhelpful. And I think it's making a lot of people on the plant-based side go to this place of almost like, there's nothing to see here. There's nothing to consider. And again, it's just not it's not helpful. There's nothing wrong with it. That's like saying in an omnivorous context, it's like, no, nothing, once it's omnivorous, it's fine. It's like, there's plenty of the whole standard Western diet's omnivorous and it's horrendous.
And you're shooting yourself in the foot, because by not saying those things and someone then transitions over and they don't get the results they want.
Sure.
Instead of saying, well, actually, you should have focused on X, Y, Z. You just hope that hope it works. Well, it might not work.
The problem then is, you get
your
what gets elevated, particularly kind of in the carnivore space, is these people who adopted a vegan diet and for whatever reason they did, and they ended up just having all these.
Their teeth fell out, their eyebrows fell off.
And I've no doubt what they were surviving on was probably just vegan Cheerios and almond milk or something. But again, this gets elevated to this anecdote of, oh well, this is what happens, and it's like the idea that any diet that's health promoting doesn't need to have a degree of well planned. And I don't think I don't even think that in and of itself is helpful. Like the idea of a diet having to be well planned, well planned in this context becomes a surrogate for a lot of the issues we've been talking about, of like having knowledge and means.
It's a privilege.
Stuff like
well
that.
planned is
privilege,
yes.
right? So yes, like that's, but at the same time, I think any diet that we're going to take, I mean, if we're doing a well-planned diet for cardiovascular health, it's going to involve certain specific considerations at the level of macro and micronutrients and food choice. Yeah. So there's nothing, I don't think it's a conversation that should be shied away from in any nutritional context.
Yeah, totally agree.
Okay. Should we change gears to something a bit more fun?
Yeah.
Not that hasn't been fun so far, but we got a little serious there for a while. I'm going to play a couple of clips from social.
Jesus.
It's walking you into a trap.
Cholesterol is good for you. Sometimes when people start an animal-based diet, they ask me, Paul, what should I do? My cholesterol went up. I say you should celebrate the shit out of that. You should celebrate the fact that cholesterol forms the backbone of all of your sex hormones.
Sex hormones.
Your testosterone and your estrogen are going to be up. They're going to be increased by more cholesterol.
Body needs cholesterol, bro.
Particles. So go kiss your lover. Celebrate the fact that as a metabolically healthy human, regardless of your LDL levels, your cardiovascular risk is lower. LDL in isolation is a piss-poor predictor of cardiovascular risk. Celebrate the fact that increased LDL means increased immune function in your body. LDL serves a purpose in your immune system to interrupt communication between bacteria.
Why is he yelling?
We should have all taken a gulp of water before listening to this.
With the highest LDL live the longest. Celebrate your high LDL.
The steam coming out of his ears.
Okay.
So painful.
Get meat, butter, and eggs. Yeah. I mean, we're going to dissect a lot of that in the full episode, but just give us a soundbite.
In 60 seconds or less.
Give us a soundbite.
Refute those claims.
How does that make you feel?
Like, it's just the same shit. This is the thing. Like, nothing changes. We're having the same conversation. They're regurgitating the same shit over and over again. It's the same points, like, that have been dealt with 1,000 times. And you're just like, we're still just coming back to this place. Like, nothing. And it's like, it's almost, it's painful to listen to, because it's just this, again, from their side, it's the same tropes, right? It's just like, I could have narrated that video myself.
True.
Body needs cholesterol. It does these things. You need it. Yeah, sure, we need it. Does that say how much we need? No. Like, longevity? No. Like, survivorship bias. Oh, you're a metabolically healthy human. LDL in isolation is one of the best predictors we have, but it's not the only predictor. It's taking that grain of truth as if the rest of us, as if the entire cardiovascular sciences field, like, hasn't thought about these other factors, right? Oh, sorry, dude. Yeah. Of course, you figured it out, and they've managed to overlook it. Oh, no one's thought about insulin resistance.
So we'll spend 60 minutes dissecting that 60-second post.
Yes.
In another episode.
Oh man.
So
you know what? They're just storytellers, right?
It's storytelling.
They mess you up. Like, maybe in some parts of the world, beans work genetically. Some people tolerate them better than others. But the amount of lectins and very specifically phytic acid in beans. Phytic acid sucks minerals out of your body. The reason Danger Coffee, my new coffee company, has a ton of trace minerals is that everyone who eats beans and grains and fake meats, we're sucking minerals out of our bones and our cells. And
Like he looks like death.
That's a valid anti-aging strategy. Seriously?
Like he looks like death.
Okay. This
is the thing. Like like Mark Hyman shows up in a thing and they're all gaunt and their
His
eyes
beans
are tired.
are beans sucking minerals out of our body.
Sucking minerals. His new coffee company.
I know. Just place that in there. Yeah.
Just drop that in product
I
placement.
know.
Oh my god.
See, this is what I was saying earlier, right? The reason why you're allowed to get this annoyed is because of the hard work you put in to get to this place, and then you have
To
guys
have some
creating
dick talk about beans sucking minerals out of your body.
likely thousands of people will go, oh, that's a good point.
Oh my god.
Better cut the beans out.
Right.
And of course, the thing about foods like that, right, is sure, like maybe someone's not used to eating them or whatever, or maybe they do. You know, there are people with like a degree of FODMAP instance.
You're right.
So it's possible to eat some foods, like certainly plant-derived foods, and like have a little bit of bloating.
Yes.
Perfectly normal.
Yeah.
It's just fucking hydrogen in your large bowel. You know, have a little bit of. Now, look, for people with IBS, it's a different spectrum. But I'm not talking about that. But this idea. So they frame normal physiology as a pathology.
Yes.
This is the reason if you're experiencing this, get rid of these foods because you're having like an adverse reaction and your body is rejecting it. And it's really easy for people then to self-confirm. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy you're asking people to jump into.
Exactly. Can I have a turn at this game?
You have a turn.
Last one, bro. Sorry.
I've got one more.
Okay. I've only got one.
What you put at the end of your fork is more powerful than anything you'll ever find in a prescription bottle. It works faster, better, and cheaper. It has the power to influence and improve the expression of tens of thousands of genes, to optimize tens of thousands of protein networks, to balance your hormones, improve your brain chemistry, upregulate your immune system, and even to enhance your microbiome. And it works without any side effects except good ones. So this is really a drug. I just will give you a quick story. I've told the story before, but it's so important to understand how quick and fast this is. I had a patient, and this patient illustrates this more than anything. She was 66. She had heart failure, angina, had multiple stents. She had type 2 diabetes on insulin for years, hypertension. I mean, you name it, she had it. She came to see us and she changed her diet. And within 3 days of changing her diet, she was off insulin. And by the way, she was on a pile of pills that cost $20,000 a year for her copay. In 3 months, she was off her medications. Her heart failure reversed. Her kidneys normalized. Her liver normalized. And she lost a bunch of weight. What you put at the end of your fork is more.
Oh. So
Doctor Mark Hyman.
Yeah.
Doctor.
Yeah, who also looks like he's had a stroke. So what's really interesting, right, is this strategy of like the talking in generalities, right? Just sprouting buzzwords as if it's like actually, and your microbiome will improve and this will go up and that will go down. And it's
What
because
does that mean?
It's just
blanket
nothing.
statement.
It's just
Yeah.
nothing. It's just sweet nothingness that sounds like it's some sort of like valid kind of scientific argument, and then of course like the lie at the end, like that this woman,
It's made up case study. I guarantee you that it's
of course it is.
made
Of course
up.
it is. It's an absolute lie.
And to sell programs and books off the back of that, to me, is the most egregious part of it.
Yeah, but we could do that right now. Like we could take this little bottle of cola and be like, low bros cola. If you drink this, things will happen in your body, and those things will be good, and they'll be great, and you'll be better, and it'll be amazing, and your microbiome.
Yeah. I know. It's so shallow.
Okay, for balance.
Well, is this a good one?
Don't want to just pick on the carnivores.
It creates obesity, it creates inflammation, it causes cancer, it destroys the gut lining. It really sets you up for disease in any area that you can imagine. So yes, dairy's got to go.
Who's that? Who the hell is that?
No, there's no shortage of those.
Dr. Brooke Goldner.
Oh God, we might have to put her.
Actually,
in the
you know
asylum.
what? She's been in the asylum, or at least she spoke about her because
sorry. She was the one who said
omega
fish.
6s. I think, or maybe it was
no, I heard
omega-3s.
that one.
Was
I
she
heard
the
that
one who said fish?
Fish is get
like,
rid of
will
it. It's
kill
terrible.
you.
Yes.
Yeah.
I heard that.
We did an episode on
Yeah.
fish because
It
of
must have
her
been
little
fish.
Right, I heard
YouTube
that.
story. Yeah.
Yeah.
She went on. Yeah, fish. It's got like heavy metals and
Yes.
it's got like too much omega 6. Yeah.
And flax seeds are better source of omega 3. Yeah.
Yeah.
Very against omega 6s.
Yes. Yes.
which is a whole nother conversation.
Yeah.
But
God, it's
thoughts
so
on that?
easy to be a quack.
Mm.
It's so easy.
It is.
You
so
know,
easy.
there's a formula.
If someone listening is like just thinking, I'd love to be a quack. I'd love to just make the most of the algorithm and cash in. Like, what steps? What kind of things would they want to kind of embody?
Yeah.
Quack University.
Yeah. No, so
I'm being serious. There might be
so-
someone listening who's
Well, so
who's
look,
thinking,
for anyone listening that wants to be a quack, I actually did a post on this recently on Instagram. So there's a few habits you want, right? So the first one is you want to actually just read around the current evidence and figure out what like the consensus is or what like the current evidence, because you need to just say the opposite, right?
Okay.
That's the first thing, is just be a total contrarian.
Habit number one.
Exactly.
Or
Habit
quabbit.
number
Let's
one.
call it a quabbit.
Quack it number one.
Quack.
And then quack it number two is once people say, hang on, you're just like being a complete contrarian, you then have to portray them and the system as the problem, right?
So you need to brainwash their sleep.
Yeah, you need to portray yourself as like the maverick that kind of operates like
I'll save you.
outside the system. Exactly. You know, they're trying to silence me. You know, it's nothing to do with your nonsensical arguments or otherwise. So it's just the fact that the conventional system, you know, or quote unquote Western medicine can't handle, you know, the truth you've figured out. And then quack it number three is you need to actually, and Mark Hyman did this really well, is you kind of start out small with really uncontroversial statements like, hey, vegetables are good for you.
Yeah.
And you get this like buy-in of, oh, they seem to be just kind of sensible. And then once people actually think you're like a little bit sensible or credible, then you just bait and switch, right? And then you're just like, just eat meat, like, or whatever it is. And yeah, I call that move the Hyman. So like just lure people in and then completely go
Hyman
off the
shuffle.
reservation once they actually think you're kind of credible.
Yeah.
And then you need to gaslight everyone. This is like quack it number four, right? So this is your get out. So anytime then people challenge you and they say, hang on, this is misinformation. You are like giving out the wrong, you just say, well, where's the harm? You know, I'm trying to help people. So basically you frame any batshit claim that you have and you try and put a little bit of sensibility on it, and you just try and portray it always as like, where's the harm? I'm just trying to help people
And it
with
worked
good
for me.
information.
Look at all these people it worked for.
And then quack it number five is you need to, this ties to like, you know, the whole idea that the system, you need to like be outside it, you know, because the conventional system is all broken, is you need to like constantly reference this kind of omnipresent, omnipotent, but completely ill-defined enemy. You know, they don't want you. They want you to eat the guidelines. They want you to follow their advice. They want you to do this, that, and the other. And of course, we're going to tell you to do exactly the opposite of what they want you to do. And then quack it number
There's a lot of quack it.
There's seven. Quack it number six. Take the pyramid of evidence and overturn it.
Yeah.
Right? So now the lowest level of evidence becomes stronger than like meta-analysis, prospective cohort studies, randomized trials. You want to rely on like rodent studies. Just find a mechanism or anything.
Or a case study in that example.
Yeah.
Individual anecdote, anything, any shred of lower quality information that confirms your preconceived bias is like better information than what's out there.
Actually, a true case study would be published at least in some sort of journal. So that's like not even a real case study.
Well, I mean, that Mark Hyman post, I think I only saw it today and I left a comment. I would love to see Mark Hyman present that actual case study.
Yeah.
Bring it up, mate.
Yeah. Publish it.
No, but publishing it goes against the
of
quack
course.
The
Sorry.
The non-published
becoming scientific.
a non-published case study is better than a published case study
because publishing is part of the system.
Right.
They want you to think it's published. Yeah, and then quack it. The final quack it is you just start becoming an expert in everything.
Yes.
Right. So maybe you start out in like nutrition or exercise or whatever, but then you basically just start taking a contrarian position on anything.
Vaccines, COVID.
I can't believe how many folks from nutrition became COVID experts.
Yeah. Virologists.
Yeah.
And I still get messages about, why don't you comment on COVID?
Yeah.
And
Because you stay in your lane.
Right.
I know nothing about it.
But it's also, it's really funny. Well, one of the things that happened during COVID is that the real kind of peak of certainly the low carb, LDL, cholesterol denialism, quackery broke during COVID because all of the Asim Malhotra, Ivor Cummins, any of them, all jumped off low carb cholesterol denialism to jump on COVID denialism and vaccine and and anti-vaccine. So it's like
that's another quack.
That's a
right.
telltale
And
right
if you
there.
look at, so like David Robert Grimes's book, The Irrational Ape, is so good for highlighting like the cognitive underpinnings of conspiracy thinking. And one of the points from that really stuck with me was that the biggest predictor of someone holding a conspiratorial belief is having a conspiratorial belief. So they tend to cluster, even if they're contradictory, right? And nothing confirmed to me that kind of like that movement is actually a conspiracy theory movement. Then seeing them all jump from cholesterol denialism and like heart disease, saturated fat revisionism to like COVID skepticism and anti-vaccine stances. And I was like, you guys are transparent. Yeah. I can see right through you now.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's so true.
Yeah. Interesting. Be interesting for someone to publish some data on that.
Yeah.
See if people can get some honest surveys happening.
I know.
I wonder if there's any association between denying the link between cholesterol and heart disease and the earth being flat.
I mean, we should look at that. Well, the Flat Earth Conference, we could survey.
Is there a conference?
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah, it's really upsetting.
How often? Every year?
I guess it's, I hope
Boys,
it's still
I
every
reckon
year.
next one we go to just for fun.
It's in Vegas, right?
I mean,
have you seen the Netflix documentary?
No.
Oh my God.
I thought you were joking.
What happens is it's the day after the low carb conference. So
In the
So
same
everyone's there.
location.
It's amazing.
Same
They
venue, same
set
hotel.
up they set up these flat earthers set up these really elegant experiments to show. They're like, well, you know, if we can see this is like laser. They've got these two elevated lasers, and they're like, well, if we can see this, and if this laser meets this, then we know that there's no curvature to the Earth's surface and it's flat. And they set up the experiment and they do it, and they're all there. Like, they're just like, well, I can't see it. So they disprove their own hypothesis, but then they just start explaining it through.
That's great.
Bless.
Oh, amazing,
it's really
amazing.
worth watching.
Okay, I'll check that out.
You just realize that they're all just people who just want friends.
Right, friends
they're
and
living
meaning
in
in
their-
that. And when you
friends
think
and
about it
meaning.
like that.
It's kind of sad.
Yeah.
It is sad. They're like living in mom's basement.
Yeah.
And they want people to hang out with.
No, we shouldn't be mocking them. No.
A little.
Can we talk about your diet? I'm really interested.
Let's start with breakfast. Right. I want to know what you had today.
What I eat in a day.
I want to know what you had today.
Smashed avo, dude. I'm in Bondi.
Yeah.
And he's having a kombucha now.
Kombucha. Yeah.
Oh my God.
Cup of tea.
What was it with that? So there was probably a couple eggs, I'm assuming.
There was, 2 eggs.
Poached or boiled?
I think they were poached. Yeah, they were poached.
Where'd you go, by the way?
It was a place literally on the corner of Oxford Street, just by the shopping centre.
Gotcha.
So smashed avocado, you have coffee?
I had iced long black and a big thing of orange juice.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. And then...
But I eat very differently when I'm traveling or out and about than I would to like in home.
So what's at home for breakfast?
Like the staple is oats.
Yep.
Big thing of oats and blueberries mixed with Greek yogurt, peanut butter, banana.
Hang on. So lectins in the oats.
Oh, yeah, you're dead, dude.
And
Dairy.
yogurt.
Yeah, and Greek yogurt.
got lactose?
Non-fat Greek yogurt.
Bro,
Yeah.
you're dead.
I'm dead. I'm inflamed after breakfast.
According to those clips that I just played.
Yeah.
You're done.
Yeah.
That's great.
I'm dead. Yeah.
And you're the fruit as well, fatty liver disease.
Okay, so oatmeal.
Yes. Yeah. So it's always pretty much
And
the staple is
do you
oats.
train fasted or
No,
never?
I usually train either late morning or
So that would be your
early
pre-workout
afternoon.
meal essentially, or
pretty much.
Okay.
Yeah. If I'm training late morning, that would be, unless it's on a Saturday. If I train like at about and in a powerlifting gym where I commute, and I'll kind of like have like a lighter breakfast because I don't want to put a weight belt on after oats.
Right.
Yeah.
Do you like to leave like sort of 60, 90 minutes?
Yeah, I like
after
to
you
be.
eat?
I don't like to be full
Right,
train.
same.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So often, like on a Saturday morning, I'll have like just a shake, some fruit, caffeine.
Do you do any cardio?
No. I cycle like around, but it's not purposeful. My activity is
Mate,
like not purposeful.
we get to the gym yesterday, and he shows up, and I go, "What are you training?" He's like, "Squats." What are you doing? Yeah, I'm going up to a heavy single. I'm like, "All right." So you want to warm up? He's like, "What do you mean?" I'm like, you don't want to just jump on a bike for 2 minutes? He goes, I go, how do you warm up? He goes, empty bar? That's a warm up.
That's
Okay.
my warm up.
Yeah, I mean, look.
It's a bit different to your kind of ramp.
Yeah, I have like a protocol, but anyway,
Okay.
but that's, I guess, more of a sports science thing that it's in my brain.
But I guess the sort of the last quarter of that is the specific movement.
100%. The
You're in
yeah.
the specific
He jumps
movement.
straight to the P. He misses the RAM, but that's okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, cool. So
Anyway.
no cardio for Dr. Alan Flanagan.
No. I'll go for a little cycle.
We'll have to work on that.
But yeah, no.
Oh, I bet you would do a lot of running though when you played rugby.
Yeah.
Training's massive. Yeah.
Yeah. But I like getting on the bike, but I like kind of what we would consider cardio to be like not goal related,
Sure.
or like I like hopping on the bike and just going for, I've got like a single speed, and just going for potters around London,
Yeah.
which is great.
How long are you here for?
Till Friday.
Till Friday.
Yeah.
Love to get a game of paddle.
Oh, that'd be awesome.
Padel. It's called padel.
It's Padel.
That'd be
Padel.
awesome.
Yeah, we call it paddle.
Is it actually Padel?
It's actually padel.
Oh, no.
I was corrected last time I was over there. So there's this. I'm going to completely butcher everything that I'm about to say. So if you're a padel expert,
Padel player.
just take it easy on me. We discovered this in Bali.
Yeah, that's right.
There was this friend of mine that's been living there. He said, you've got to come play this game, padel. And it's kind of a hybrid between tennis and squash. So it's a court that's probably half the size of a tennis court.
Yeah.
You play in doubles, and at the sort of the back half of the court has
Like perspex or
perspex, glass, and you can hit it off that.
Okay.
There's a bunch of different rules and sort of technical aspects to it, but it's so much fun. There's so much banter.
Brilliant.
And anyone can get in and get, you don't have to be like a gun tennis player. And it's the best cardio.
It is
But it's a reminder for me that if you can make your cardio fun,
Yes.
I like, for me personally, so much better.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd play paddle 7 days a week if I could. It's that much fun.
Yeah. Okay. We'll try and get a game. in.
Yeah, it'd be good. There's a
it'd
court
be good fun.
in Sydney now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's so you got breakfast,
Breakfast is always,
both traveling and at home. But overall, how would you the sort of dietary pattern I've heard you before sort of describe it as eat Lancet.
Ish. So I would, to put kind of nutrition labels on it, I would describe my kind of like in-home day-to-day diet as lacto-pescatarian.
Mm-hmm.
So although like, had eggs for breakfast this morning, but I don't buy eggs in a supermarket, so they're never like at home in the fridge. And I don't buy meat, and by meat I mean any kind of like white meat or red meat or anything like that. So like, fish and dairy would be the kind of would be in the fridge along with tofu.
So you do eat soy?
Huh?
You do eat soy?
Of course. Yeah.
I love soy.
And I drink soy milk.
Oh my God.
Which, I get a bit of gyno, and it's just. But I love baiting all of this on social media because it's so good. But there's a really good company in the UK that do these like it's like it's like tofu that's like, say,
Like
southern fried
marinated?
chicken style,
Yeah.
crispy and
Beautiful.
stuff like that, and it's great to like fry up with
Yeah.
and stuff. Tempeh I can't.
You don't like tempeh?
No.
Yeah, okay.
Is it the texture or the taste?
It's the texture.
I reckon I could cook you some good
Yeah.
tempeh.
Okay.
No, we can change that.
And then the rest is just like, I just love legumes as a food group generally. I don't really eat a huge amount of nuts.
What would you say is like Irish traditional food? Like what?
Well, so this is the thing. So I want to clarify, like, when I say that's my in-home diet, I use the word in-home for a reason. Like, that's how I choose to eat on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah.
But it doesn't necessarily mean that I entirely exclude. Like, if I go home for Christmas,
No,
my mum
sure,
is like
sure,
baked
sure,
ham.
of course.
Yeah.
I'm eating
Mate,
the
of
baked
course.
ham.
We're talking the majority of the time.
So it's like, so in that context, I remain kind of omnivorous in kind of broad context.
Sure, yeah.
But yeah, the day-to-day in-home diet is more so.
You live in London, right?
Yeah.
I grew up in Ireland.
Yeah.
But-
So traditional Irish. No. Grew up in Hong Kong.
Well, that's right. You told me.
So
So you've had huge exposure to lots of different food in Hong Kong.
yeah, it was amazing.
Yeah. But you know that they, fun fact, highest beef consumption, red meat consumption per capita, and highest great longevity, right? And that association often gets completely misrepresented.
Yeah.
But it's one that the low carb crowd loves.
use that as a
Yeah, look at Hong
defense.
Kong. Everyone,
Yeah.
highest red meat intake.
So what is your reason for cutting meat out, or at least limiting?
I think it's impossible to ignore that there is an environmental component to our diets and to just the bigger question of kind of where things are going. And that would be the driver. I've engaged as much as I can with the kind of more ethical or kind of moral aspects of the question, but I've find that in and of itself is a study, an area of study, and there's only so far that I've got to it without realizing you'd need to, for me anyway, would need to kind of like really down tools and get to grips with the various philosophical constructs that exist, what the implications of those constructs are. And I've never much been interested in moral philosophy on any question.
Sure.
So for me, it was kind of like there's these three strands to the potential conversation. There are people that will make ethical decisions, right? And then there's and for me, between the two, it was very easy for me to look at the environmental aspect of the question and recognize what the contributions were. And
is that because you've got data, you can see?
Yeah, you can look at it.
Clear.
It's just like, look, this is what it is.
Right.
And you know, there are like Eat Lancet is, although I disagreed with the kind of way it was framed. Like I said earlier, I found it a little classist, but ultimately I can look at those recommendations and I can say there's pragmatism here.
Sure.
And there are things that I can apply. So with dairy intake, for example, Eat Lancet was kind of like 0 to 500 grams, right? So I try to kind of average. I would say I average about 300 grams a day. And that's pretty much always the same food choice. Like, so I don't drink milk. So that 300 grams is almost exclusively either quark or non-fat Greek yogurt.
Okay.
What's quark?
Quark is like a kind of, it's technically a cheese. It's a soft cheese.
Soft cheese.
But it's basically a yogurt texture.
Right.
Okay.
And it's
kefir.
completely fat-free. So all my dairy sources are like, you know, non-fat.
Quick, just on the fat question, then come back. I think you're going to go to the ethical.
Yeah.
But on the fat, so you're saying
Don't worry.
He's coming in hot.
that you choose low fat,
Non-fat. Yeah.
non-fat.
Yeah.
Is that because you're wanting to reduce your exposure to saturated fat? Are you worried about the saturated fat that exists in dairy when that milk fat globule is intact?
I'm not, but I do know that I am in a family that is very responsive. Like we have high cholesterol levels.
Right.
My brother is on statins. He's 35.
Really?
I'm probably going to end up jumping on them. I need to get my cholesterol like checked properly again. It's been, you know, a long time, but like if it's high, I'm jumping.
So when you
straight
say
on
if
drugs.
it's high, what do you consider high?
I mean, if it's anything over 100,
Right.
I'm like Phoebe.
Do doctors though? Let's say because I've been messaged by a lot of folks who let's say they land at 115, 110.
No, to be honest, if
their
it's
doctors
115
won't do
or
it.
if it's 115 or 110, I probably won't.
Right.
I would probably again, but see the thing is for someone like me, if it was 115 or 110, like I don't consume much by way of like I don't have a high saturated fat diet at all. I would say if I had to actually measure my fat intake, I would say I actually probably, depending on the day, have a fairly decent fat. Like I free pour olive oil and I fucking drown stuff. Oh my God. Yeah. I don't measure fat. Like I could easily have probably 200 ml of olive oil in a day, maybe 300.
No.
Yeah. Cause at lunchtime, I'll always like get like a rice bowl. I'll fill like half of that with like, you know, hummus and then the other half with like olive oil and I'll just dip bread. And
Wow.
My lunch is always like super Mediterranean.
Yeah,
you know?
I would love to get your baseline where it's at, and before you got a prescription for a PCSK9 inhibitor or a Zetamide.
Prescription, like I'll get it on the black market.
Before you went and did that, I'd love to see 30 days on a completely whole food plant-based diet. What happened?
With lower fat.
Well, not even worried. I wouldn't even worry about the low fat.
No,
I just. I mean, tropical oils.
I will agree
right?
to. I will agree to something like that.
Yeah.
The next time I get it checked,
Yeah.
which will be soon after I get back, I will agree to if I have some specific targets.
Right. And I say not low fat because I mean, I think there's some benefit in having the polyunsaturated fats higher.
Well, I have. So I consume. So my two main oils are like extra virgin olive and rapeseed oil or canola oil.
Canola. Tucker would send you to the grave.
Canola needs a much better PR agent.
It really does. It needs to ditch the word canola.
Can you?
It also needs a better word than rapeseed.
Yeah, shocker.
In 60 seconds,
horrendous.
Right? I sit down with you and I say, Alan, I know that there's lots of stories about canola and the processing and hexane and trans fats and blah blah blah. I've heard that story. You're telling me that it can be part of a healthy diet. What evidence do we have that looks at canola oil and health outcomes?
Yeah, it's the most recent video lecture I just did on Alinea. So we've like multiple meta-analyses of interventions showing improvements in blood lipids like LDL cholesterol, total cholesterol, ApoB. But what's most interesting, although consistent with 70 years of what we know, is when you compare what canola oil is compared against in interventions, still better than sunflower oil, still better than olive oil if we're talking about blood lipids. But when it's compared to saturated fat, in the most recent meta-analysis, so compared to sunflower oil, about a 7 milligram per deciliter lower cholesterol level in the canola oil group. Compared to olive oil, about the same. Compared to saturated fat foods, butter or whatever, 25 milligram per deciliter lower.
Right.
Then you look at, say, the other two main endpoints that people talk about, inflammation, lipid peroxidation, literally no evidence that there's any adverse inflammatory effect or lipid peroxidation. And
no evidence. So let's just pause on that for a moment, because that's a pervasive claim, right?
Multiple studies, either no change, sometimes a decrease.
What's the best review paper or best paper that would look at? Is it Philip Calder's work or
for canola? So for poof. So I'm talking specifically about canola oil.
Is there a paper that you?
I'll send you.
Right,
we can link to them. We'll link to a few. And there's even a recent intervention that looked at it on liver fat in women with PCOS compared to sunflower oil, lowered liver fat levels. But here's the thing: when I was doing this lecture, I was like, let's just put our nutrition hat on and come back around. The nutritional I think an argument can be made, putting olive oil aside because it has the extra polyphenol content. The nutritional composition of canola oil is very unique and incredible. Like, so olive oil per 100 grams would have 14 grams of saturated fat. Right. Canola oil is half that. It's the lowest saturated fat content of any oil.
I didn't even know that.
It has, of its monounsaturated fat, which it primarily is composed of, it has the highest oleic acid, what makes olive oil, one of the reasons, omega-9, has a higher oleic acid content than any seed oil, and second only to olive oil in oleic acid
By how
content.
much?
By about like 10 grams odd. Like it's it's second. But what it has that olive oil doesn't is a really high level of ALA, of omega-3. And that level of ALA is like kind of on a par with some of these other vegetable oils or seed oils. But then it's got a lower, so it's kind of, although I don't read too much into the 6-3 ratio, it does have higher 3, lower 6, really high 9. And then it's got vitamin E, vitamin K, phytosterols.
Gosh, sounds like a superfood.
Right?
You sold me.
So just looking at its nutritional composition, tell me how this is having adverse effects in the body. Of course, it's not. All the evidence points to a really beneficial impact.
Did you tune into the nearly 4-hour debate with Matthew Nagra and Tucker?
I can't bring myself to.
It's hard to listen.
I can't bring myself to. I really, having suffered through 2 hours with Tucker, I don't know how Matt did, don't know how you moderated for 4, but he's insufferable as an individual. So yeah, Matt has the patience of a saint for working through with him.
He's very patient.
In ways that I found it really difficult to, and yeah, it was horrendous. It's the thing I regret the most in terms of anything public I've ever done.
Debating.
Yeah.
Did you come across? Are you happy with how you came across?
No,
or?
it was horrendous. Oh my God, I sound dumb. Like, listen to it. I sound like an idiot.
I don't think. No. That's not what I
sound like I don't know what I'm talking about.
No.
How many years ago? Was
I
this?
think that you checked out.
I did check out a little bit.
The conversation wasn't at a intellectual, it wasn't at a high enough level for you.
So you fall to the level of your opponent, basically.
Yes, that definitely happened. No, well, I would just say that you just checked out.
No, but you know how like sometimes if you're dealing with someone who is rudimentary on their understanding, it's hard to stay at that higher level.
But he was also just lying as well.
Right.
Like we know that he was just actually lying because we fact checked a couple of things. Nick Hebert went and actually emailed a researcher afterwards, and she was like, "That's my completely misrepresented
the meal replacement thing." But I think my take on watching that was that you were just
dying
frustrated by where the conversation was going, that the points that you were making, it didn't seem like he was really acknowledging those.
But he would just go, the one thing I'm disappointed about is just from a purely debating perspective, I kind of let him, but this was the problem with it not really being a moderated kind of debate, is I kind of let him, he would go down a rabbit hole that would be completely unrelated to whatever main point I'd make. But rather than kind of just keep restating that, I'd kind of follow him down the rabbit hole.
Instead of saying it's irrelevant.
In my head, I was always like, oh, well, this point's bullshit, so we need to get on to it.
Which is what Matt did really well.
Very good.
Because I was moderated, but I think Matt actually self-moderated.
That's irrelevant.
But he learned from your
Well, that's the thing. There was like, because I know from chatting to Nick that they were like, they did a huge amount of like prep, going into it.
Have you had debate? Like, have you learned how to debate? Is that a skill that you've?
I did debated throughout college.
Right. And law, I imagine being.
But this is, but these are completely different. Like collegiate debating, you're presented, and yes, there is ad hoc where you're making points. But like it's structured,
right?
You know,
and you have a moderator who really keeps you on.
You have adjudicators. You have your time to go. You can field questions or not. You can make questions or not. And then in a legal context, it's the same. The plaintiff opens his case. Yeah, it can get heated, but you're, again, going back to that point of you're both proceeding from the same set of facts. You're arguing over an interpretation. It's the same with a debate. Like in college, you've got the motion, this house believes we should ban abortion would be the motion. And, like you've got to often argue a position you don't even agree with in real life. But again, the parameters, you're proceeding from the same basic point or premise or motion.
Yep.
And in law, you're proceeding from the same set of facts and you're arguing over what those facts mean. In this wasn't a debate. This is you're playing chess against a pigeon.
Yeah.
That's a completely different parameter.
I want to circle back to the ethical question that you had.
Yeah.
But just on the record, you've signed up within this intervention. You've signed up to a baseline ApoB test and then a 30-day.
Yeah. Okay. I'm happy with that.
Is 30 days
let's see what happens
to see a meaningful result?
Probably. Because factor in that I don't, so I would eat
Yeah, you're already
fish.
80% there.
I would eat fish, 3 times a week.
Salmon or what kind of fish?
Salmon, mackerel, always oily. Sea bass, love sea bass.
Yeah.
So 3 to 4 times a week, and then the daily staple as far as would be Greek yogurt.
Okay.
So I'm not like
he's not that far off, but still interesting.
So I would be interested to see.
Yeah,
would be interested to see.
So the question I wanted to ask you, and I'm not trying to grill you here.
No,
this is
fine.
genuine,
that's
really a genuine question that I've wanted to
He
ask you
is
for a
trying to
while, but I
grill,
saved it for in person. No, I'm not.
That's the kind of language that we use in the den.
In the den.
In the vegan den.
The grill language. Yeah. We're firing up the barbecue.
Soft sell.
Yeah, whenever you start with, I'm not trying to say this, but. Okay, so just on a personal note, for me, it's interesting to hear you say that for you, the environment and health aspects are the easiest to sort of grapple because you've got data, you've got research, you can understand that landscape. The reason I want to ask you this is, for me, it's actually the opposite. I find those things the hardest, but just because of my training, I'm not an academic like you. The easiest thing for me to grapple is the ethics and the animal and the philosophical side. For me, that it just, I feel like that is just the most simple way for me to understand, or for me, it's the biggest lever that I pull. Maybe it's because, not everyone, here's the other thing. Not everyone loves animals, and you don't have to love animals. But I just feel like that particular lever, for me, I can pull that so easily.
Sure.
Right? And I'm wondering why that one for you isn't the case.
Well, so again, so one thing I've noticed in a couple of the kind of arguments where I have engaged with someone who's very kind of more on the ethical side, and so it's a philosophical conversation.
It's a philosophical conversation, yes.
It seems that almost uniformly, they're kind of operating from the same philosophical school of thought. This kind of utilitarian approach, harm reduction, maximization,
unnecessary suffering,
and all of this, which on just even a fairly superficial look at the area of moral philosophy as an academic discipline is one framework of viewing things.
True.
Not the framework of viewing things. So that automatically puts my little kind of almost academics of, well, why this? Is it this because it suits the kind of outcome intended? Or is it this because it's actually a better philosophy? And how do we decide that one philosophy is better than another?
What would be an alternate philosophy to that?
Yeah.
So there's the guy that Danny had. Did you ever
I
listen to
listened to that series? Yeah, I thought
Did
it
you
was
remember
amazing.
the guy that was
Was that Alex? No, Alex was one of the guests.
He's the cosmic skeptic.
guy.
Yeah, yeah, he was insufferable. In my opinion, he's the
Right.
kind of person that would make people eat meat, like in
Out of
terms
spite.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah. It's that. It's
Yes.
yeah.
He's in your face. He's abrasive.
Yeah, he's like, you're on the wrong side of history. You're a piece of shit.
It's funny though
You're-
that you say that because he does have a bit of a quote unquote cult following of.
But
people.
it's
Yeah.
like-minded folks who
Right.
already have bought
Yeah,
into
it's like
what he's
this,
saying.
posh English Oxford boy
Yeah,
telling
he's got a
everyone
preppy,
they're
yeah.
a piece of shit. It's
Yeah,
just like,
correct.
God, the accent alone.
Yeah.
Anyway, so no, the academic that he interviewed, the guy based in the States, was really good at kind of, because he laid out a few, and then so you have other schools of, was it Kant or no, where the idea of suffering is vis-a-vis maximizing human existence, so to speak, maximizing an individual's existence, and that creates a system of competing trade-offs and considerations. So again, I'm not saying one is better than the other. It's an example for me of, if I wanted to reconcile these from an ethical standpoint, for the way my brain works, I'd have to get to grips with each of these positions,
Right.
and come to my own conclusions on it.
Yes.
It's far easy. I'm still getting the same outcome. You know, if I'm not buying beef to put in my fridge,
Yeah.
I'm still getting the same outcome
True.
of harm reduction in that system.
Yep.
But my reason for doing it is primarily environmental.
Sure.
So I don't necessarily. So because of that, because the outcome is largely similar, I'm kind of like, well, I'm getting to that point anyway from a decision made in a kind of different context. And maybe one day I will sit down, but part of it is I just don't have the time to actually get to grips with becoming familiar with those levels of moral philosophy to then weigh up where I stand on it.
Yeah.
And one point, so I'll be really honest here, I'm probably going to get lynched after saying this for the listeners. So one point that I've got to in some of the moral philosophy or ethical conversations that I've had with people on this is, if you point to, forgetting the actual philosophical theories, schools of thought that feed into this, if you point to the systems of meat production that exist in our food systems and say, I can look at that and I can agree just at a level of principle that that's pretty fucked up, even though I've primarily made a decision for environmental reasons.
Right.
And I can absolutely accept that. So in that sense, the outcome of there isn't beef in my fridge is congruent with me also recognizing that. But if you tell me, for example, that the anchovies that I will put on a piece of bread with hummus and olive oil that there's some sort of equivalent, that there's just this uniform equivalence that applies to the fish, and I don't know what it was going to do the day. I can't.
I hear what you're saying.
I can't see it. I can't look at I can't look at an anchovy and be like.
Can I play the argument of what a cosmic skeptic would say to that?
I know. Yeah,
you know the
I know,
argument.
Yeah,
okay,
I
so
know,
there's no
yeah.
point even going.
Well,
there.
if a human had scales, would you eat it? Well, there
well,
isn't
no,
a
not
human
even.
with scales.
It's more. It comes back to the unnecessary. So like, assuming that all sentience, so that anchovy, will swim away for its life. If it's being chased by a larger fish or whatever, or a fucking human being, whatever it is, it wants to survive.
But it's programmed to.
It's
We're
programmed
all
to.
organisms.
Right.
Do you think eating that anchovy, it's more or less likely that you would be contributing to suffering?
So here's a problem with, and this is a very individual thing, and it's going to sound a bit dark. I have some weird thoughts on suffering generally, as it applies to humans as well.
Hit me. Let me hear this.
Well, So I'm
just going to put my seatbelt on.
typically, I have my default, as I've come to realize, is a rather kind of nihilistic view of the world, in which I find it very difficult to extract meaning from existence, from humans.
I've got a lot of that too. I got to be honest.
So
Can you just elaborate on that?
Yeah. So my kind of default is we have ways as humans that we have like devised or attempted to devise meaning from a world that is ultimately completely random.
Mm-hmm.
And there are certain things we can control and there are certain things we can't. But ultimately, it's often, as a default, I'll look at, you know, when we try and celebrate life and make it about all this kind of stuff. And I'm like, yeah, but we're kind of born. We kind of like do things and exist. And then we kind of just die and go into the ground. And nothing matters.
So nihilistic.
Nothing matters. Like nothing we do matters.
Yes.
And that's that's not a great place to be. So I try and obviously construct meaning from what I do and the relationships that I have with people as a way of saying, even if nothing, so this is where I try and move from nihilism to existentialism. I'm like, okay, assuming nothing matters or there is no meaning, create it while you're here.
Okay.
So that's what I basically try and do.
Okay.
But a big part of this is this idea of suffering, to circle back to this idea. And I'm like, suffering, it's almost too rosy for me to be, like contributing to suffering. There's suffering everywhere. So, and that's not that's not to engage in a fallacy here. It's just, how am I quantifying the sardines suffering?
What about, so you say you find it hard to find meaning, the meaning, but do you think it would be fair to assume that that's the same for all other humans and animals, that they themselves don't have meaning to their existence?
I think humans are different because we have higher cognition.
Right.
But see, then someone like Cosmic Skeptic would say that
that's
intelligence,
speciesist.
It's speciesism, but not even that intelligence is not a moral separator. The moral separator is, do you suffer in the same way that the anchovy or the cow does? Do you feel the same pain? Do you want to live as much as they do?
Or else is like someone with a disability, is their life worth the same as someone without a disability, an intellectual disability?
So, but then that's that process. Then I find, so okay, intelligence is not what did you call it? Like a moral separator. A moral separator. But there's any multiplicities of like layers to it. Doesn't need to be intelligence or otherwise. Like I don't know, this is what I've kind of struggled with in some of these conversations, is trying to have this like uniform standard that's applied across the board. I don't know that exists in the real world in any domain.
Yeah.
But wouldn't you come back to science? So I think where people would go with that is say, well, because I think you're talking about suffering, and is it uniform across all of these different creatures?
And any of these
right?
kind of, I guess, rather like adverse concepts or suffering or harm.
So wouldn't you come back to science then with your scientific mind and look at the ability to, what I guess suffering, we would say, I mean, there's emotional suffering, but then there's also physical suffering that you could quantify somehow objectively through science and say, okay, there's a greater chance that being would suffer through its consumption than not.
But what is suffering in this context? This is what I find it really hard to compute is what constitutes suffering. And I find it really hard to think, I don't know why. Yeah, I find it really hard to compute a concept of, and then secondarily, and maybe this is where it comes back to probably needing to do a bit more in the philosophical schools of thought. I don't understand why suffering becomes such a emphasis on what we want to eradicate necessarily. I can understand maybe,
Can I give a practical example? Maybe this, because then I'll be able to understand it a little bit better. So right now your diet is, let's say, 85% plant-based, right? And you've got some dairy, some fish, right? Alan on Monday sits down and has his normal meals. And then on Tuesday, you have all of those normal meals, but without the fish, without the...
Which does happen. I'll have a couple of days in the week, depending on food choice, which won't have like a lot of my meals throughout the week, for example.
Yeah.
And certainly a total day might not have any.
So I guess the question is, by removing the fish and dairy and having the accessibility, the intellectual ability to know how to swap and replace those foods. Because this is what Danny said on the podcast, which I really found amazing. He was like, if I really think about it, I probably do have a moral obligation being in the position that I'm in.
I do remember him saying that.
And I was like, wow, that's such an interesting way to put it. And he's like, but I'm not ready, or it's a weakness or whatever. I don't want to put words in his mouth. But basically his point was, if you look at where he is at intellectually, his understanding of nutrition, et cetera, he is in a position to make that moral judgment, even if we're wrong about the suffering thing. Let's just say...
So benefit of the doubt.
Benefit of the doubt. I can still play the benefit of the doubt, replace those foods, be nutritionally adequate, be healthy, be fit, be strong. And if those animals did suffer, well, I don't have to contribute anymore.
So similar to kind of that, like me saying like the environment and the harm thing kind of comes to the
outcome's
same place.
The same. Yeah.
So the absolute short answer is because I get joy. I get enjoyment from. I haven't I've tried a lot of say like soy. I think they're horrible. I love.
That's an honest take.
Love
that's a very
Greek
honest
yogurt.
take. Yes.
I love cooking fish.
Yes.
I love making like a lovely fish curry or whatever. It's just enjoyment. It's literally just
fair,
enjoyment.
So, because there's probably different, like people listening to this will react in different ways.
Yeah.
Right?
Oh, yeah.
Okay. So I think we can acknowledge that.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
And that's fine. That's just part of having lots of unique humans.
Yeah.
I think though, if you were to kind of like say, put people into buckets, you kind of have a big section of people that will say, if you're eating an Eat Lancer diet and you've reduced your consumption of animal foods, you're part of the solution. Right?
Yep.
That's going to be a big chunk of people.
Yes.
I think people know where I stand on that. And then, which is, I'm there.
Yeah.
But then there is going to be another side that'll say, no.
You haven't gone far enough.
Yes.
If you are not eating a 100% animal-free diet, then you're actually part of the problem.
Right.
Yes.
How do you break that down?
Yeah. Hey, this is the hardest part of this whole conversation. Is where can you, at your current position right now, what can you achieve? So, like an analogy is kind of like you're walking down the street and you see 5 dogs struggling to survive in a pond. They're drowning, right? You've got to go to you got to live your life. You've got a meeting in an hour, whatever. You've got an opportunity to save some of them, but maybe not all of them. Do you save some of them?
Labradors.
Labradors.
To leave the small ones.
Okay. The question is like, at what point is doing something good enough? So if you save one in not all 10 of them, is that okay? Do you have to then commit to all 10? What if you save 8? So it's like, I feel like any step in, like you just said, any step in that direction is a fantastic thing to do. But if you have the capability to pull it off all the way, I feel like, as Danny said, the moral obligation. But then again,
but that's just a circle, because that side of the dichotomy that Simon just described, right? The difficulty with that extra is that it comes back to a framing of morality and moral values. So that's where the religiosity enters into the conversation. And that's why I think it's so difficult, because to someone who's there, no one else is good enough until they're there with them.
Right.
That's a conversation that suddenly these considerations we've been talking about is, things like kind of say either the environment or knowledge and means, and all of those stuffs are kind of like things we can be a bit more like objective about in a sense. As soon as it gets into the area of morality, that's where it will always, because everyone's morality is different. It's honestly like sitting down with someone who has deeply Catholic values and having a conversation about abortion. You're never ever going to come to any reasoned conclusion.
You know what's happening in that situation is that, let's say you are in that camp of 100% is the only way to be part of the solution.
Yeah,
I think a lot of that is through the personal experience of being there. That person, let's say that if they were to think about eating animal foods, or maybe they were when they were transitioning, they felt that they weren't living like a life of alignment. Things weren't congruent in their life, and they felt that unease. And then you then take that feeling and you assume that everyone else ends up in that exact same position. But what you're saying is you don't have that, and that comes back to what morality means to you. I completely
to different people
understand your position.
So I know I have the nutritional knowledge to be able to like plug gaps. I know that I have the ability in terms of like means I can go down to my shop and overnight I could not have certain food items in the fridge. But a lot of the certainly the suffering thing is so complex to me anyway. I'm just kind of like, how do we have this obligation in the context of the way the world works? But more importantly, it's kind of like, it just honestly with these choices often just comes down to the fact that I'm aware of that. There isn't necessarily cognitive dissonance here. I actually almost go through this every time I like make fish. I'm looking at it being like, And part of it is just, I can't see that there was a greater interest versus the current place that I'm at of actually enjoying the way I eat.
Yeah, do you think you should use the word current? Like, so do you think that's a fixed sort of view of morality for you?
No,
or
it's not even a fixed view of any of these other questions either. I mean, you brought up recently the podcast episode with the development of like dairy lab-based proteins. Like, if we have products on the shelves that come from that source versus products that come from husbandry, I'm opting for that.
Because for you, it's about taste and enjoyment, and it's the experience of the meal. See, there's some people who, if it's not the real thing with the blood and the bacteria and the shit and whatever, they won't take it.
I don't know. Yeah, and I don't understand that. Even if like because there is the technology of like producing like red meat in a lab, like producing steaks in a lab.
I think I would eat that.
And personally, if that was available right now, I wouldn't change the way my day-to-day diet is, because I actually really enjoy my current diet. Yeah. But I'd certainly, if it was like, steak night or something, or that one, then I would opt for that over.
Agreed.
And we didn't touch on the health aspect at all.
Yeah, because it's really not,
Can I present one more interesting thing that I noticed? A video went viral a couple days ago of a vegan activist yelling in the face of a man who was pushing her buttons by eating a kebab. She was on the streets of, I think it was New York or somewhere, and they were doing their vegan activism, and this guy came up eating like steak or beef or whatever and was just eating in front of her and like kind of rubbing it in her face. And she was like abusing this guy with the most horrendous cuss words and just swearing in his face and treating him way worse than she would ever treat an animal of any kind, right? So when we talk about morality, I think in the vegan space, we have this high standard of morality to animals and a lower morality standard for human beings sometimes.
But however, I will just to push back a tiny bit.
Sure.
Because I 100% agree with that. Video? Every time I see that stuff, my heart sinks.
Yeah.
But I will say, in a non-vegan world where a lot of people don't want to be vegan, and there's various reasons for that. Yeah. That type of content, even though it's probably 0.5% of vegans, just gets amplified. It's the same thing as saying like, vegan parents starve their kid.
Exactly.
When do you see the headline saying that omnivorous parents starve their kid? We have to remember there's a bias through most journalism and mainstream media, which really is damaging for the whole vegan movement.
What you're describing there is not exclusive to veganism at all. And again, if we go back to kind of wider correlates of people who choose to kind of eat certain ways, if we look at some of the kind of like political, sociological research, again, we pretty much know that people who are like real insistent on like eating meat as a part of their identity tends to correlate a lot more with like right-wing authoritarian views of like dominance over animals, stuff like this. You know, people who are vegan are almost uniformly left of center, liberal, and have certain, and so part of what you're describing there is actually a current that runs through modern liberalism, and it's a really ugly current, and it's a current I don't like, because a lot of these issues are now framed along moral lines, whether they're questions we have in society over race, gender, any sort of identity, sexual identity or otherwise. We've created these system. We going back earlier to what we talk about, like the difference between I am versus I currently hold X belief or whatever. Is
if you said I'm currently vegan, you'd be ostracized.
Well, right. And so this is the thing. So we've created, in all of these kind of conversations, we've created this really ugly strand of intolerance amongst modern liberalism, or people who identify as liberal and progressive are the most intolerant of anyone with another alternative viewpoint. They're the most intolerant of anyone who thinks differently about any issue. And we've basically said on a range of these issues, we've said, here is the line in the sand. These are the facts that you have to accept of the scenario. And if you don't or slightly fall out of step with us, we'll eviscerate you. And it's a really ugly side of this whole conversation that I, as someone who politically lines up on most issues and kind of like center left. Yeah. But I consider myself someone who's there because of very kind of traditional left-wing views of society, class-based focused issues. And this intolerance on the part of people who nominally identify as kind of progressives is really disconcerting. And we see it across a so it's not just vegans.
It's true.
In this context, it's but you probably have a large proportion of people who, you know, again, because of the kind of political correlates of people who tend to follow vegan diets being slightly more on that side of the fence.
Yeah, that's a good point.
I have a question about the health side of things.
Yeah.
I think we finished the grilling.
Yeah, sorry, dude.
You're Alan Flanagan.
I went easy.
He's charcoaled.
I'll grill you at dinner tonight.
He's carcinogenic. It's very well done. Well handled. He might not ever come back. No, I wanted to talk to you just quickly about red meat, because I do think this is one that you've done, I'd say, the best job at covering in terms of the question around just purely health. And I think Lane Norton maybe has a bit of a different view on it, slightly different take from what I've heard. Don't want to misrepresent, but I think that he thinks most of the effects of a high red meat diet being associated with, say, cardiovascular disease or like colorectal cancer is driven by the fact that those diets tend to be lower in fiber, plant matter, fruits and vegetables, and therefore there is, say, confounders in this data that could better explain what we're seeing. You're across that. And I think you would point mainly to the study out of Canada, the Alberta study to show that if you sort of account for that
vegetable intake,
then you see the effect size disappear or lessen. So I guess just for people that are intrigued by this, if we're talking just unprocessed red meat, what's your view on health, exposure level, the current science that exists?
Yeah, so for unprocessed red meat, we have a scenario where, depending on the levels of intake in a cohort, you can either see, and the population, you can either see no real increase in heart disease or otherwise other outcomes. You might even see a little bit of a decrease if it's populations that consume low levels, particularly in women. It may relate to things like increased iron status or otherwise. That's usually in Asian populations. And then you will and can see increased risk at higher levels of intake, daily levels of intake. And you can also see that across populations. And this becomes really important. So the threshold of intake in any given cohort for unprocessed meat really matters to the analysis. The covariates that are potential confounders, I'm less concerned about, because in robust, well-conducted prospective cohort studies, those factors are largely adjusted for in analysis. Body weight, smoking, exercise level, otherwise history, family history of cardiovascular disease. Now,
Fiber?
Fiber, vegetables, fruit.
Yeah.
I'll come to the Alberta Men's Tomorrow study anyway, specifically. But one point to make is that statistical adjustment is statistical adjustment. It's not wiping out the fact that someone smoked 20 a day for 40 years.
Right.
Statistical adjustment is taking the average effect of that particular exposure over that cohort and basically adding it into a model to see whether at any level of that covariate, the association between your exposure, red meat, and your outcome, heart disease, actually changes.
So just quickly, just on that to pause, because I think that sometimes people might get confused by that whole multivariate adjustment thing. So like people are familiar with randomized controlled trials. So a randomization, I guess one of the primary purposes of that is you take a big group of people, split them up into say 2 groups, and you're hoping that you should, if it's done well, get even distribution of say alcohol consumption, smoking, body weight, blah, blah, blah.
Yes.
But with an observational study,
you don't do that.
You don't do that.
Yes. So the main difference, so randomization's benefit is that there is an assumption that unknown covariates are equally distributed between groups. That's the real methodological, scientific kind of supposed beauty of randomization. If it's a known covariate, smoking, body weight, then there are methods with randomization to make sure that you have equal distribution of those between groups. So you have the same number of men and women, the same levels of BMI in both groups, the same baseline levels of whatever, education and otherwise.
Sure.
But the assumption of randomization that makes people comfortable with causal inference is that any unknown covariates that we don't know about yet are assumed to be equally distributed between groups. Now, in the context of epidemiology, if there's unknown covariates in a randomized controlled trial, they're still unknown in a population study. Right. Now, usually, if it's been well conducted and you still have a significant association, then people will say this generic throwaway term of, well, residual confounding cannot be ruled out. That's basically saying, look, stuff we don't know about could potentially be influencing the outcome. But because you can't randomize people in an observational study, statistical adjustment is what you use to achieve the same balance between groups, essentially, that you would with randomization. Right. But this is really important because if we've got prior knowledge that there are things that influence an outcome, we use that prior knowledge well. A well-conducted cohort study conceptually can achieve the same thing if we know what those potential confounders are.
They're defined.
And we know for most of these outcomes we're interested in, the big pick, smoking, diet, alcohol intake, education status, like family history of disease, you'd want to be thinking of something pretty niche.
This is a great point because on Twitter, you often see people say, well, if it's an observational study that someone shared with a great multivariate analysis, really, the researchers were well aware of like confounding and adjusted for it. They had a great surveys and data collection so that they knew well-defined cohort, and people will still say, but confounding, but they won't put forward what
the confounder is. Exactly.
If you can't put one
just
forward,
say residual confounding.
If you can't put something forward, then it's probably not the greatest sort of line of thinking.
Yeah, it's going to be an enormous breakthrough to find out what this thing that's influencing these outcomes is that we don't know about yet, right? And again, keeping scientific skepticism in place, there could be such a thing. Maybe
putting
it's 5G.
Your phone in your pocket.
Right? But as far as these health outcomes we're interested in, we've got our red meat as our exposure, for example, and we've got heart disease as our outcome. What these analyses do in epidemiology is they look at, do different categories of a potential confounder influence that association? So into your model goes, well, let's take smoking is the potential confounder, and we'll divide people into less than 10 cigarettes a day, 10 to 20, 20 to 30, 30 to 40, 40 to 50. And we'll look at whether any of those levels influence the outcome or the association. And so where that's and what you'll typically find is they'll have different models, right? And all a model is what's being included in that analysis, essentially. And it's called a model because a regression ultimately is a mathematical equation. But you'll usually have, say, a model 1, which just adjusts for like sex, BMI, and age. And then they might have a second model where they add a couple of other things. So this is allowing you to actually see how that changes over time. Almost uniformly, model 1's risk estimate will be really high.
Right.
And then it comes down as further things are adjusted
that
for.
That person who was consuming more red meat in model 1
was
also alcohol smoking, blah, blah, blah.
So what you tend to get to is by model maybe 3, or depending on the analysis, 4 or 5, whichever it is, if by the time we get there and we still have a statistically significant risk estimate where the confidence intervals are at such a kind of spread that they're not too close to it being insignificant, then you've got to explain, let's say there's a 30%, the hazard ratio is like 1.30, right? You have a 30% relative risk increase of this outcome. And the confidence intervals are 1.21 to say 1.36. So 21% to 36%. If someone's going to argue for residual confounding, they're going to have to argue that some factor we don't know about explains 21% of a risk.
Make sure you put this in the ebook that's going to solve all the misinformation.
So what I say about the unprocessed red meat stuff is we have a lot of really good cohort studies that are well executed and they've well adjusted for these factors. Typically, if the intake of unprocessed red meat is less than 100 grams a day, we don't typically see any associations with heart disease, cancer, or otherwise.
What's 100 grams of red meat, do you think, to sort of eyeball? Is that like small. A deck of cards?
It's probably just a palm.
Yeah,
it's probably just a palm.
Yeah.
A palm.
A palm.
Is that how you say it? Palm. Palm. Do you say, is it palm or palm?
A palm. P-A.
What do you say?
An A.
But he's got an accent.
It's an A, not an A.
Yeah.
I don't know.
I'm just picking on his accent.
So, and then when we start to look at like these thresholds, when you find studies where the top group is over about 150, 60 grams a day compared to lower intake, then you do see risk emerge and you do see it statistically significant and you do see fairly robust confidence intervals and you do see it surviving adjustment for all of these various levels of these covariates. And more importantly, you see it in different populations. Now, the popular study that people love to cite is this cohort study that came out of Canada, which was a really, really nice, well thought through way of analyzing this. And it said, well, look, there's a difference between including something just as a covariate in your model versus actually specifically modeling how your exposure relates to the outcome at different levels. So actually almost like a direct comparison at different levels of intake. So that's your primary comparison here is red meat at this level of fruit and veg, this level of fruit and veg, this level, low, medium, high. And what they did was they looked at that for processed and unprocessed meat. And what people overlook in that study was processed meat was pretty much associated independent of your fruit and vegetable intake. So that's another nail in the coffin for processed meat.
So you can't offset it with a healthy.
You can't offset it.
Does bacon fall into that category?
Yeah, anything that's salted, cured, dried.
I've seen people questioning that on social media that not all bacon is ultra processed.
Yeah, I've heard that
too. So apparently there's bacon that's like nitrate free. It's a big marketing thing in America. I don't know enough about it, if I'm honest.
Yeah.
But importantly in that study, when it came to the unprocessed red meat, yes, what they showed was that the unprocessed red meat in the low vegetable category, there was a significant increase in risk. But in the highest vegetable category, fruit and veg intake, that was abolished. Now, what people have misinterpreted is the exposure in that study relative to the dose thresholds that I've just described. Because what they did in that study was not look at daily intake. They looked at weekly intake. And the highest cohort, the highest group in that cohort consumed around 460 grams a week, not a day. Do the maths here.
So they're under that
This
threshold.
is average. It's about 65 grams a day. The World Cancer Research Fund recommendation for unprocessed meat is 500 grams a week as a limit at the top. And all of the other analyses that we have, Epic Oxford, the other US cohorts, and some of the other Epic subgroups, again, all when they're less than that threshold. So there's nothing particularly surprising about this finding. And it's being misinterpreted to suggest that a high red meat intake.
It's relative.
This was weekly categorization of red meat intake. So the actual highest level of intake in this group was still completely congruent with both the WCRF's recommendations and the wider research showing that at less than 100 grams a day with high fruit. So for me, this finding just kind of corroborated that at these lower levels of intake, some modest red meat, unprocessed red meat intake with a wider healthy diet is probably not going to.
What does it say about the fact that with even just in this study, I know that you made the threshold point really clear, but what does it say about the fact that as with increasing amounts of fruit and vegetable, the risk went away? Is it that red meat is not as deleterious? Are the fruits and vegetables actually interacting with the red meat?
Possibly.
Or is it that the fruits and vegetables are inherently beneficial and just as you eat more?
Both. Right. I would say both. Based on Kate Bingham's research, the metabolic ward studies on like high red meat intake, unprocessed red meat intake that looked at carcinogenic processes, attenuating factors. So when I look at that, I kind of think it's both.
Okay.
I think
Are they looking at it in the same meal, like in a sitting? Because if you ate red meat on its own, because I'm wondering if literally like it interacts in the gut where like the fiber locks.
There's
antioxidants.
potential for that as so far as it might relate to the actual production of carcinogens in the first place.
Yeah.
Where a lot of the compounds that we would find in fruits and vegetables kind of essentially prevent that process.
I think most people would be having mixed meals.
Mixed meals.
Yeah.
And so, so the short answer is I think it's both. I think that at that level of intake, it's possibly Kate Bingham's research had to use like 400 grams a day of unprocessed red meat to kind of show these like the carcinogenic kind of processes. And that was in the context of feeding people fruit and vegetable and not or fiber added. So I just think if someone's consuming an average of like 70 grams a day, it's probably also just not enough of a level of intake to generate enough of these adverse effects.
So to challenge the current recommendations, you would need to see some data that shows, say, north of 100 or 150 grams a day average, and with a healthy diet around that, there's no effect on, say, cardiovascular disease. That would be the data that would get you thinking, oh, okay, maybe there's something here.
Yeah, and I haven't seen that yet. So I think for processed red meat intake, I think for processed meat, the data is pretty clear and unequivocal. I think for unprocessed red meat intake, I think it's just a nuanced answer to the question. And that doesn't work well when you've one crowd that want to just be like, epidemiology is bullshit, just eat fruits and vegetables and eat red meat, versus people saying, well, it's just inherently harmful. And so what I'm seeing a lot, particularly in the social media conversation, is kind of abuse of a concept. I don't think it's willful, but it's this concept of compared to what? Compared to what as a statistical approach creates additional assumptions for how you interpret that. So what's happening on kind of in the wider conversation is that people are interpreting it as if it's just a straight food swap, because that's how it reads. Oh, well, isocaloric replacement of 5% of energy from red meat with, legumes or a plant protein was associated. Okay. So people are then interpreting that as that's just a straight food swap, right? It's not, unless whatever's been adjusted for in that model is probably not the totality of diet. So what those what that regression model actually is it's that replacement in the context of the wider dietary pattern that is unadjusted for. And that's really important. And that then comes back to the characteristics in that cohort.
When you say it's unadjusted, don't most of those substitution analyses though like
they'll adjust for
they still adjust for fiber and fruit,
but
and
there's still that's the thing,
and saturated fat and stuff often.
Yeah, depending, but there's still a wider dietary pattern associated with that swap, right? So it's creating an assumption of that wider dietary pattern, and unless every single food has been specified for in that adjustment model, sure, the nutrients might be, but unless every single food is, then there's just, so it's just all it is a little bit of like, you know, it's not necessarily always a straight food swap. And I think it's also being slightly interpreted maybe in an oversimplistic way, because we don't define our dietary choices based on like straight food swap. We can do, but like it's not a total diet. Sure. Diets don't come down to dichotomized choices between. So my question would be, just as a hypothetical, imagine there was a substitution analysis that modeled the replacement of lentils with chickpeas and showed a reduction in risk.
Yeah.
Are we then saying lentils are
right.
lentils are out?
Yeah.
Substitution analysis showed. So I think we need to be a little bit more refined about, and Deirdre Tobias wrote a really good paper on this in response to an paper that was published on kind of eggs and dietary cholesterol, about actually substitution models developed to model macronutrient isocaloric replacement. They're really more intuitive to interpret, because you are literally just interpreting the replacement of saturated with monounsaturated fats, for example. Food-based substitution models are still a work in progress in epidemiology. And there's a couple of really good papers on them, but the food-based substitution models are much more complex than straight just macronutrient swaps.
So just to break this down, so you're basically saying, if you say you swap red meat for fatty fish, that because there's so many differences in terms of the nutritional profile, you're saying that we can't account for that?
No, I think we can over time. But what I'm also saying is that, let's say people in a wider dietary pattern. So if people that are replacing, let's say you're modeling that 5% change from people in the cohort who have X level of red meat intake, and that X level of red meat intake is coming with a wider dietary pattern that those types of people consume. And then you've got people who maybe consume fatty fish in that example, and they also have a wider dietary pattern that is different to those people. Now, there are certain factors that we will know about that will be adjusted for in that analysis, but it doesn't account for everything in those differences. And those differences may matter for how we interpret that.
There still is some utility, though, I would have thought. Like, if they are adjusting for like the main things, like let's say, for example, because just to push back a little bit.
No, I'm not criticizing. Substitution models are brilliant.
Right,
I think they're being a little oversimplified in the wider conversation. They're really complex, like regression models. That I think so I'm not saying that necessarily red like meat is like with unprocessed red meat. I'm not using what I'm saying about substitution models to say
to defend it,
it or defend anything really, like as a food. I'm just saying our interpretation needs to also think about the wider characteristics of a given cohort, and that will likely matter. So, you know, ultimately, though, I think those dose thresholds that we've discussed are fairly representative of what the research does show. And so I can understand where someone like Lane is coming from, you know, where you've got people who are consuming a wider, and they exercise and they're fit and they're healthy and they're doing all of this stuff. So I can kind of understand where they're coming from, but I am conscious that I think sometimes they overstate the no association part. There is an association, and it is at higher levels of intake. And I don't think anyone should take those interpretations to mean I'm going to eat 400 grams a day. Because you're going to have an adverse, you know, all of the data shows there would probably be adverse effects over time.
I've actually been surprised in a few of those other substitution analyses that have shown, say, benefit for like swapping, let's say, red meat for fish or red meat for, say, lentils. I've been surprised personally, if you look at the ones that, there's quite a few that have looked at animal protein, swapping 3% of calories for plant protein. And in their adjustment models, they adjust for saturated fat and fiber. But I'm always left thinking, well, in a real life substitution, and this comes back to your point that these aren't perfect and sometimes they're not actually considering what would change in someone's diet in a real life setting. Because if I just decide myself, I'm going to eat less red meat and I'm going to eat more, swap it with chickpeas, my saturated fat intake will go down.
Yeah.
My fiber intake will go up.
Yeah.
My plant protein intake will go up.
Other nutrients.
Whereas
will
those
swap
adjustment
as well.
models have leveled the playing field on fiber and unsaturated fat.
But maybe not on folate or iron or others. So
correct.
That's to the point.
They're not
of
perfect.
Yeah, exactly. And they don't need to be. We've got enough, but it's just, it just comes back to the idea that decisions in diet don't necessarily come down to just a dichotomized food choice all the time.
Yeah, I mean, you see those Instagram posts a lot of like swaps, like
with a line down the middle.
With the line down the middle. That drives me crazy.
Yeah. So I think, look, ultimately for the processed red meat intake, I'm not convinced that at these kind of lower, modest levels of intake, which that Canadian study that's kind of a bit misrepresented also had, I'm not convinced that in the context of high fruit and vegetable intake and other kind of, lifestyle behaviors that it would pose a risk. Again, that's purely on the health equation now that we're discussing. But I think it's pretty clear in multiple cohorts, including EPIC, the NHS, HFPS, or HPFS, and other studies that there is a risk at these higher levels of daily intake of even unprocessed red meat. So it's not a free lunch at all. And the lack of association seems to be very clearly at kind of very modest levels of.
So if fruit and veg are offsetting the red meat intake, and then we now have a carnivore movement of no fruit and veg and 10 to 100 times the red meat intake.
Depends which version of the carnivore diet you're doing.
Version,
There's a plant-based version.
Of the carnivore diet?
Yeah, that's the one with a lot of fruit in it.
Yeah, that's true. Well, that's probably why Saladino saw some improvements in his blood lipids.
Yeah. He started
eating fruit and vegetables.
But your question is, what's the long term?
Yeah, how do we know? How can
well, we're
someone
not going
stand
to
by
know
that?
until they start getting colorectal cancer and otherwise. So that'll probably take. The problem with these chronic diseases that we study when people start going on these crazy diets is we're not going to know. The latency period for these diseases is a matter of years, and we're not going to have outcome data for extreme diets for a decade.
Yeah.
Maybe 5 years.
What if someone says, well, I feel better, I've lost weight, how can this be bad for me in the long term?
Yeah. I mean, I think people do tend to focus on the kind of short term and particularly the aesthetic. And look, it's not to discount someone's subjective sense of well-being or how they feel, but I would typically say, look, you've just done the most extreme iteration of an elimination diet. Of course you feel better. You've narrowed your food selection to 1 to 2 foods.
Yeah.
I mean, dietitians and nutritionists have done this since the 1950s, although typically it was done with like rice and lamb and foods that were considered hypoallergenic. So to do that, I'm not surprised that someone then, whatever was ailing them in the first place, in the very short term, says that they feel better.
Right.
But it's basically the crudest form of self-experiment.
100%.
And it's not actually getting them to the bottom of what ailed them potentially in the first place.
I'll give you an example of, so I train a couple of young guys who have type 1 diabetes. And I'll say to them, when we start the workout, I have like a checklist of things like objective and subjective that I want to get from them to see how the quality of this workout's going to go. And I say to them, how do you feel? You got a lot of energy? Yeah, I feel great, ready to go. Okay, awesome. We're going to do you feel strong today? Yeah, really, strong. All right, we're going to lift a little bit heavier loads today. Let's take this intensity up a notch. Have you checked your blood sugar? No, I know I'm good. I'm all good. Oh, but you haven't checked it? No, I can feel it. I know that I'm good. Check it. And it's like 7 times the normal range, like super elevated, right? So it's like this idea that you can feel good, but what's going on inside that you can't see or measure, but in this case we can measure, which is awesome, is completely different to the subjective experience.
Yeah.
So it's like these people who feel good and have lost weight and have energy and the brain fog's gone, on a molecular biochemical level, you don't really know what's going on.
Yeah, you don't know whether you've, LDL plugging into your arteries.
Right.
And you
can't
don't know
feel
whether
that.
there are carcinogenic processes going on in your large bowel. And, you don't know whether, so these things are not visible. So,
And it's hard to even, I can imagine, draw your attention and focus on that if you've had a transformative
Yes.
experience because you shed 20,
Don't wanna
30
let it go,
kilos.
yeah.
You don't feel puffed going up steps.
Yep.
Your, say, inflammatory symptoms are down.
Yeah.
Then it's difficult for you to not be so impressed by that side of things.
Yeah.
So I can kind of understand how it occurs.
Yeah, I can understand it. Oh, yeah.
Gosh, we've been chatting for many
Midnight.
hours. I want to ask you something before we finish.
Yes.
And it's to do with your PhD. I think you said that you told me yesterday there's a study coming out, I think that, or has been accepted out of your group.
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
I'm not sure of the details. We only briefly chatted about it, but I know that we were talking a while ago about Daniela Jakobowicz's studies, and there's been a few different studies, but the general gist was that randomized controlled trials looking at what happens if you eat more of your calories at breakfast versus at dinner in situations where calories were
Not controlled.
Well, not controlled, right?
Yes.
Okay, I'll let you go into the details, but the way that I guess it's communicated is that the bigger breakfast, there was a
6 kilo difference in weight loss.
Yeah, 2.5 times greater weight loss in having more
Front-loading your
your calories in the start of the day rather than the end of the day, and also I believe some improvements in like blood glucose control and insulin resistance, HOMA-IR, etc. You've got some interesting thoughts and things to share on this.
This is one of those interesting kind of questions, which I think is an example of why we always need to be granular about what, if we're saying something has an effect or doesn't have an effect, like on what, you know? So I see a lot of people now dismissing, well, look, you know, the temporal distribution or the time doesn't matter. Really what they're saying is it doesn't matter for weight loss. It might really matter for other outcomes, like particularly for glycemic control.
Blood glucose.
And particularly for people that are on the spectrum already of glucose intolerance, pre-diabetes type 2. So the Jakubowicz papers looked at this high energy breakfast, 700 calorie dinner versus 200 calorie breakfast, and the opposite, 700 calorie breakfast, 200 calorie dinner. And they suggested greater weight loss and other outcomes. And you can see other studies as well, like the Bath Breakfast Project. People had to eat 700 calories before 11 a.m. Randomized control trial as well. They had both lean and participants with obesity. And there are other interventions that have done this. And yes, so it'll come out, well, hopefully soon enough. But yeah, the Aberdeen group did an intervention kind of doing the same.
So I got this wrong. This is not your PhD, unrelated.
No, it was the same grant.
Right,
that my
same
PhD
grant.
was on. But we did the kind of lab-based forced jet lag kind of study to tease out the circadian stuff. They did at Aberdeen, they did like an intervention, high energy breakfast, low energy, but they prepared all the meals.
Oh, so the Jakubowicz one wasn't like an inpatient with the meals.
No,
it was just instructions.
This is really important.
Okay.
Because, so, like, not to give the game away too much because it's not published yet, but like for weight loss.
When's it coming out?
Well, it's been accepted.
Okay.
So I don't know however fast, you know, cell metabolism get things published.
Oh, so I wasn't meant to ask you about this. It's a bit cheeky that I
really,
threw it in
no,
there.
it's okay. You know, and so, yeah, like but we could expect that, right, for weight loss. But importantly, they did actually find significant benefits like appetite, right? You know, and hunger, particularly with like the high energy breakfast. And if you look at the Jakubowicz group,
right,
the previous year to that big study that still people talk about, they published a paper, same protocol, but they looked at they measured ghrelin. And what they found was that the high energy breakfast, high protein, high carbohydrate energy breakfast suppressed ghrelin, the hunger hormone, not just during the weight loss period. They were on a hypocaloric diet.
Did you say high protein, high calorie?
Yeah, high protein, high carbohydrate.
How
many calories a day?
1,400.
Yeah, that's pretty low.
Okay.
And then they followed up 16 weeks after weight loss, and ghrelin was still suppressed in the high energy breakfast group.
And ghrelin, being the stimulating.
And then we also know from a guy, De Castro, did a lot of research on kind of meal patterns. And he looked at what he called the satiety ratio, which was a ratio of someone's subjective sense of like hunger relative to the timing between meals. So if you're sated from a meal, if you're actually like full, you don't want to eat again an hour or two later, right? So it factored into the timing between meals as well. And what he found was that in eating patterns which kind of like shifted eating to later in the day, people typically not only started to eat more with each meal, but had a shorter time frame. So they were eating more, but they weren't actually getting satisfied from that meal. So they had a lot of energy coming in the evening.
What do you think explains that? Like at a different time of the day, the same meal can have a different effect on how full you are.
So it may relate to the fact that there also appears to be a circadian rhythm in appetite, subjective appetite and hunger, as well as and so it may be that high energy intake early in the day, it doesn't necessarily have to be breakfast, quote unquote, but early in the day seems to dampen that and have a beneficial effect on people's ability to kind of regulate hunger and appetite intake, or hunger and appetite, and consequently energy intake.
That seems fairly intuitive. I mean, that doesn't seem like
in
a
some
crazy,
ways.
Yeah.
But, you know, a lot of this research, I think, was kind of overblown to suggest that actually it was the high energy intake in the morning was maybe increasing thermic effective feeding, energy expenditure, and otherwise. And like there's little to no evidence to support that. But I think people are probably barking up the wrong tree there. I think if we actually look at this distribution research, I think what's probably happening is there's a behavioral effect of high energy breakfasts or high energy intake early in the day, translating to better hunger and appetite regulation.
Right. Maybe you expend more.
Yeah. And now if we're talking about the kind of metabolic outcomes of this type of approach, then it is pretty clear that for people that are on the spectrum of glucose, for otherwise healthy people, the magnitude of difference is quite small. But for people on the spectrum of glucose intolerance, absolutely there is a reduction in
which is not a small number of people.
No, not at all. And it's not just that the response to, say, the first meal in the day, it's the actual responses to subsequent meals is much more attenuated.
So this new study, right, that'll come out, they found no difference in weight loss. But so I can see like the media potentially misinterpreting this in terms of communication.
No benefit to breakfast.
Yeah, because
of course.
The way that I now sort of interpret that is that, okay, well, in this very controlled environment, there's no difference in weight loss because you're literally controlling how much food these people get. But if there is this big breakfast kind of benefit in terms of suppressing your appetite in a free living, this could be really important.
And that's what I think explains the findings in that 2013 Jakubowicz paper. I think that group just had all of these kind of like better appetite, less hunger, and ate less and lost more weight. So I do think there's a behavioral component. I don't think it applies to everyone. Across the board. But I do think there are definitely individuals who will benefit from that type of approach.
What is it? Night owls and morning larks.
Yeah.
I wonder if that ties into it at all.
Maybe. Chronotype may be a factor, but we just don't really. We've suggestive kind of cohort studies. Most of them are cross-sectional, so they're not prospective. We've a really interesting one intervention by a group in Spain who did a chronotype adjusted diet where they randomized people based on chronotype, and then their distribution of energy was relative to their
Can you explain chronotype?
Yeah, it's your genetic predisposition to have a certain time of day preference. So it's not a personality trait. So you could identify, for example, you could think of yourself as like a morning person because behaviorally you like getting up in the morning and going for, but you might not necessarily have an early chronotype to do that. So there's and now look, they tend to correlate quite strongly. Yeah. But the point is that this chronotype is conceptualized actually as more of a kind of circadian rather than behavioral marker.
And that's genetic.
Largely driven by genetics.
Right.
Genetics in order of what contributes to chronotype, most importantly, genetics, age, and sex. So yeah, and it's measured using melatonin, like an actual measurement of melatonin, and it's like your midpoint of sleep, basically, is what your chronotype is.
Oh, okay.
So basically, it's a way of kind of just looking at whether someone is a morning type or a night. Most people in the population are kind of intermediate types. And then you'll get people that are kind of outlier really early and outlier really late. So it does follow a relatively normal distribution. But yeah, this intervention found completely equal weight loss between groups, even though their distribution of energy was different. but the distribution of energy was kind of later in the late chronotype group and earlier in the early group. So there's a lot more to that picture that we just don't know about yet. And we do need better research and some more interesting interventions to come out.
But the interesting finding there is that if you do control calories, that there's no difference in weight loss by having more of your calories in the front or the back. No. But however, there could be a behavioral aspect where in a free living,
and there could be, you know, like metabolic benefits.
I had Courtney Peterson on. I think you've seen one. She's now done a couple.
I'm well familiar with her research.
She spoke exactly about that, about the fact that with like time restricted eating, they've seen independent of weight loss, some potential. There's small number of subjects in some of those studies, but some signal that there's benefits for blood glucose control in people that are having some difficulty.
Yeah, exactly. And now whether that is better as an earlier window of eating versus, say, in the afternoon, we still, again, the needle would lean towards, for metabolic endpoints, the earlier window being better, but we don't really have good enough studies to conclusively answer that yet.
Not as soon as you wake up.
No, not necessarily.
Yeah, so it could be like a couple of hours.
Yeah. And that's what was good about the bath breakfast study. It didn't say, you know, like a specified, it was kind of 700 calories before 11 a.m.
Right.
You know?
Okay.
You had to have some food within 2 hours of waking, but it was largely, you know, the energy intake was like before 11 a.m. So I think that was kind of pragmatic. Yeah.
Cool. Well, we need to make sure we get some dinner into him.
Solid.
You know, I did have a question that we haven't touched on, so maybe we just finish with this.
Okay.
Supplements. I'm wondering, you know, what your view is just on, there's so many different supplements out there. If you were to kind of just summarize things and say to people, what are the supplements that you can say are kind of based on the evidence that you've come across or what you use personally are actually worth spending money on?
Is this for performance or health?
Both now. Creatine, with that recent review that came out on like cognitive benefits.
Right.
Creatine monohydrate is probably the cheapest and most beneficial supplement someone could take. People don't need protein powders, but in certain dietary patterns or just lifestyle contexts, if they're busy, they can be useful and helpful. And then outside of that, I just don't really think that there's much extra unless it's a like specific indication. Like maybe obviously people who are iron deficient need iron, those kind of contexts.
It's like a nutritional gap.
Yeah.
If there's plugging a nutritional gap. But I really can't think of any supplements that I think are beyond that are kind of, you know, essential or that people need to get. Yeah, it's funny, you know, I took all of the supplements when I didn't know anything about nutrition.
And now you're saving your money.
Yeah.
And if and I think I've asked you this before, but if people listening are kind of just eating a standard diet and they're going to make one change or focus on one sort of component or one thing, best bang for their buck, what is it?
In the context of the current diet pattern that we have, in
Stop
kind of
following Paul
industrialized,
Saladino.
yeah. As far as I think in the context of the current typical like industrialized Western diet, I think if I was to pick anything, it would be eating more fiber. Population averages of 11 grams a day. I mean, it's I think if you were to do a single thing, it would be getting that up to 30 grams a day. Yeah. And by implication of doing that, the food choices required to get there are going to have ancillary benefits, of course. But I think as far as, you know, population average, what would I say, you know, get your saturated fat from 12 to 9%, maybe. But in terms of what magnitude of benefit would be most accrued, I think given population averages, it would be fiber. Yeah.
Okay. Well, mate, enjoy the rest of your time here in Oz.
I will. Thanks,
Glad
lads.
that we got to do this one in person.
The vegan den.
Yeah,
It's a pleasure. I did.
You're certainly you're a crowd favorite on the show, mate. So it's
hopefully
pleasure to have you on, and
it's been a pleasure to be
I look
here.
forward
in
to
person.
tomorrow.
Let's try to get a lift in again before you go.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, let's get a lift in
Some
and
squats tomorrow.
Yeah. I need a deadlift actually.
All right, I'll do some deads with you. Fine.
Yeah.
Okay.
Awesome.
I think we did it.
Good stuff, boys. That was
Great.
fun.
Cheers. Thanks, Alan.
Thanks.
Thank you for joining me for this episode and your interest in science-based conversation. I hope you enjoyed it and found the information covered interesting and instructive. If you did and you'd like to show your support for the show, please subscribe to our YouTube channel where you can stay up to date with new episodes and watch them in video format. Yes, the full-length videos. Please also consider subscribing to the show on the Spotify and/or Apple Podcast app, wherever you enjoy listening to podcasts. You can also leave a review on Apple or Spotify. Again, a great way to support the show and make our content more discoverable for others to enjoy and learn from. If you have any comments about the episodes, suggestions for future episodes, including guests you'd like to see on the show, or questions that you'd like to have answered, please leave those in the comments section on YouTube. I myself and my team will take note of these comments when planning future episodes. Finally, the best way to support the show and receive discounts on products we love is by checking out our sponsors at theproof.com/friends. Enjoy your week, stay well, and I look forward to catching you in the next episode.